The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Judge Jessica Carter strode forward, her heels striking the polished marble floor with a rhythm that echoed purpose and authority. She carried herself with an unshakable poise, her dark eyes fixed ahead, betraying none of the storm brewing within her. Today was no ordinary critical sentencing loomed on her docket, one that had kept her awake for nights on end, wrestling with the weight of justice and its delicate balance. Her leather briefcase swung lightly in her grip, a quiet companion to her resolve, its contents meticulously organized as a reflection of the mind that wielded it. But as she neared the entrance, the air shifted thick with an unspoken tension that clung to her like damp fog. Officer Ryan Blake stood sentinel near the security checkpoint, his broad frame rigid, arms folded across his chest. His cold, unyielding stare latched onto Jessica the moment she came into view, tracking her every step with a scrutiny that went beyond protocol. It wasn't just observation, it was judgment, laced with a hostility that prickled the back of her neck. She met his gaze for a fleeting second, her expression a mask of calm, though her pulse quickened faintly beneath it before pressing onward, undeterred. As she approached the metal detector, her sharp eyes caught a jagged scrawl etched into the edge of the security desk. "Women in power ruin order." The words were crude, scratched in haste, yet they carried a venom that Jessica had encountered too many times in her climb through a system that often resented her presence. Her fingers tightened around the briefcase handle, the leather creaking under her grip. But she didn't falter. She'd faced worse than petty graffiti. "Good morning," she said, her voice smooth, and even as she reached the checkpoint, offering a greeting that was more habit than warmth. Blake stepped forward, his boots thudding heavily against the floor, and his gruff reply came like a blade. "ID and bag." Jessica slid her courthouse badge from her coat pocket with practiced ease and set her briefcase onto the conveyor belt, her movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. Blake snatched the ID from her hand, his thick fingers lingering over the laminated surface far longer than necessary. His lips twitched into a smirk as he read her title aloud, Judge Carter, his tone dripping with a mockery masquerading as politeness. "Quite the busy morning for you, huh?" Jessica stood still, her posture unyielding, though a flicker of irritation danced behind her steady gaze. "You could say that," she replied coolly. "I trust everything's in order." Blake shrugged, passing her ID to a younger officer standing nearby, a weary man with nervous eyes, who clutched it like a lifeline. "Standard procedure," Blake said, his voice clipped and sharp. "Step aside for a secondary check." Jessica's brow arched, a subtle challenge in the curve of it. "A secondary check," she repeated, gesturing toward her badge now trembling slightly in the younger officer's hands. "My credentials are right there." Blake's smirk widened, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Just following protocol," he shot back, the words edged with defiance. Jessica tilted her head, her voice dropping to a measured calm that carried an unmistakable weight. "Is this protocol specific to me, Officer Blake, or is everyone being screened twice today?" The air grew heavy, the hum of the courthouse lobby fading as a handful of nearby officers fell silent, their sit-along glances darting toward the unfolding scene. The young officer holding her ID shifted uncomfortably, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard, caught between the brewing storm of his superior and the judge's unwavering presence. Blake's smirk vanished, replaced by a glare that hardened his features like stone. "Are you questioning security measures, Judge?" he snapped, leaning forward slightly. "That doesn't seem wise in a courthouse." Jessica took a single step closer, her heels clicking with precision, and lowered her voice, not in retreat, but in a quiet intensity that cut deeper than any shout. "I'm questioning the consistency of those measures," she said. "If this is standard, I'm sure you won't mind explaining why it wasn't enforced yesterday when I walked through without issue." Blake's jaw worked silently, his mouth opening and then clamping shut as her words sank in. He cast a quick glance around, perhaps hoping for an ally among the onlookers, but the other officers remained still, some curious, others uneasy. "Step aside, please," he finally growled through gritted teeth, his authority fraying at the edges. Jessica's jaw tightened, a fleeting sign of the frustration simmering beneath her composure, but she complied. moving to the designated area with a grace that belied the tension coiling in her chest. Blake approached with a handheld scanner, his movements slow and deliberate. Each sweep of the device an exaggerated performance meant to assert dominance. The scanner beeped faintly as it passed over her briefcase, then her shoulders, and he paused, letting the moment stretch into something uncomfortable, a silent power play. "Clear," he said at last, his tone flat and devoid of remorse. Jessica reached for her briefcase, but Blake's hand shot up, halting her. "Wait." Her patience, already stretched thin, frayed further. "For what?" she asked, her voice a razor's edge. Blake tilted his head, his smirk creeping back. "Bag search. Standard protocol, of course." Jessica exhaled slowly, a controlled breath that masked the fire building within her. "If you're determined to proceed, Officer Blake, let's make this official." She slipped her phone from her pocket, her fingers swift and sure as she tapped the screen. A faint chime signaled the start of a recording, and Blake froze, his eyes narrowing as realization dawned. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with a challenge he couldn't ignore. His gaze flicked to the phone, then back to her, his jaw clenching tight. "You think this is going to intimidate me?" Jessica let the silence hang, her unflinching stare pressing against him like a physical weight. "No," she said at last, her words deliberate and cutting. "I think it's going to ensure accountability." Behind them, the whispers among the other officers swelled, a low murmur of unease rippling through the group. A young female officer near the X-ray machine shifted her weight, her brow furrowing as she watched, her hands twisting nervously at her sides. Blake, however, squared his shoulders, his expression darkening. "Fine," he spat, gesturing sharply for her to open the briefcase herself. Jessica unzipped it with methodical precision, revealing a neatly arranged array of legal documents. A tablet and a sleek pen set, tools of her trade laid bare with quiet dignity. She stepped back, allowing Blake to inspect it, though his hands moved with unnecessary roughness, rifling through papers and tapping the tablet screen as if searching for something to justify his actions. "Busy day, huh?" he muttered, his sarcasm thick enough to choke on. Jessica didn't flinch. "Every day is busy when you're working toward justice," she replied, her voice a calm rebuke that seemed to echo beyond the checkpoint. Blake snorted, snapping the briefcase shut with a force that rattled its contents. "Clear," he said again, tossing it onto the counter with a carelessness that bordered on disrespect. Jessica retrieved it, adjusting the strap over her shoulder with a deliberate slowness, her eyes locking onto his. "I hope your morning improves, officer," she said, her tone measured but pointed. "Hostility doesn't serve anyone here." Blake's face reddened, a flush of anger creeping up his neck, but he held his tongue. Jessica turned and walked away, her steps steady and resolute, the murmurs of the officers fading into the background as she tuned them out. She knew this was only the beginning of a small skirmish in a larger war she'd been fighting her entire career. As she reached the secondary screening area, Blake was already there, waiting with crossed arms and a smugness that seemed to swell in the presence of his colleagues. His disdain was palpable, a living thing that hung in the air as he motioned for her to place her briefcase on the table. "Let's get this over with," he said loudly, ensuring his voice carried to the cluster of officers lingering nearby. Jessica set the bag down and straightened, fixing him with a gaze that could have pierced steel. "If this is necessary," she said evenly, "then let's ensure it's done by the book." Blake's smirk returned, sharper this time, as he leaned in just enough to test her boundaries. "By the book? I didn't realize judges were experts in security protocols now." The young female officer by the X-ray machine took a hesitant step forward, her voice trembling slightly as she ventured, "Officer Blake, I think I've got it," but Blake cut her off with a sharp gesture, his authority a wall she couldn't breach. Jessica watched the exchange, noting the young woman's unease, the way her hands fidgeted as if itching to intervene, but held back by fear or habit. Turning her attention back to Blake, Jessica's voice remained steady, though it carried a quiet fire. "I'm sure your team is capable of conducting screenings without unnecessary theatrics. Shall we proceed?" Blake's expression darkened, his fingers digging into the zipper of her briefcase as he began his inspection. each movement a deliberate show for the audience he'd gathered. "Judges like you think you're above the rules," he said, loud enough for the others to hear. A few heads turning in response. "It's good to remind people that no one is." Jessica's response was calm but unyielding, a blade wrapped in velvet. "Rules are meant to be applied evenly, officer. Singling people out doesn't uphold theme, it undermines them." Blake snorted, his hands rummaging through her papers with a roughness that bordered on provocation, tapping her tablet screen without purpose. "Looks like someone doesn't like being held accountable," he muttered, his voice carrying a sneer meant to sting. Jessica didn't rise to it. Instead, she reached into her pocket, retrieving her phone once more, and set it on the table with a soft click as the recording app blinked to life. Blake froze, his hand hovering over her documents, his eyes narrowing. "What's this?" he demanded, his tone sharpening. "Transparency," Jessica replied, her voice a quiet thunder. "Since you're so committed to protocol, I want to ensure we're both protected from misunderstandings." The room grew still, the tension thickening like a storm about to break. The young female officer bit her lip, her eyes darting between them, while another officer, a grizzled veteran leaning against the wall, shifted uncomfortably, his weathered face tightening as if sensing the line Blake had crossed. "You think this intimidates me?" Blake growled, his voice low but brimming with defiance. Jessica met his stare, unflinching. "It's not about intimidation," she said, her words a steady drumbeat. "It's about accountability we both benefit from in our respective roles." Blake slammed the briefcase shut, the sound reverberating through the lobby, a crack of thunder in the charged silence. "You're something else," he muttered, shaking his head as if to dismiss her, though the tremor in his hands betrayed him. "Fine. If you want to make a spectacle, let's do it." He grabbed the scanner again, gesturing for her to step aside. Jessica complied, raising her arms with a dignity that turned the act into a quiet defiance. Blake waved the device over her, each pass agonizingly slow, a deliberate taunt masked as procedure. The scanner beeped faintly, and he lingered longer than necessary, his breath heavy with frustration. "Clear," he finally barked, though the words sounded like a concession wrenched from him against his will. Jessica lowered her arms and turned back to the table, her movements smooth and unhurried. "Are we finished?" she asked, her voice a calm challenge. Blake didn't answer immediately, his silence a festering thing. Instead, he stepped back, his chest heaving slightly as he wrestled with the realization that his power had limits, and that Jessica Carter knew exactly where those limits lay. She gathered her briefcase, her fingers brushing the leather with a quiet reverence, and walked away, leaving him standing there, diminished in the wake of her resolve. The lesson was clear. Justice wasn't just a word she wielded in the courtroom, it was a force she embodied, a shield against those who abused their authority. And for Blake, the bitter taste of regret was only the beginning of understanding the consequences of his actions. The air in the security checkpoint buzzed with an electric tension, thick enough to choke on, as Officer Ryan Blake spun toward his fellow officers, his voice dripping with a condescending edge that seemed to erase Jessica Carter's presence entirely. "You see what happens when folks start believing their fancy titles grant them a free pass," he sneered, his words slicing through the hum of the busy courthouse lobby. "They forget the simplest rules, like how to respect the chain of command." His broad shoulders squared with a smug certainty, as if he'd just delivered an irrefutable sermon. Jessica, standing mere feet away, felt the sting of his dismissal deep in her chest, a quiet fury igniting beneath her composed exterior. Her fingers tightened briefly round the handle of her briefcase, but she refused to let her face betray the storm brewing within. "That's enough," she snapped, her voice a sharp, deliberate blade that cut through his monologue with surgical precision. The sound echoed faintly off the polished marble floors, drawing a few curious glances from passers-by. Blake wheeled back toward her, his lips curling into that infuriating smirk again, a mask of arrogance that barely concealed the flicker of unease in his eyes. He tilted his head, sizing her up as though she were a minor inconvenience rather than a federal judge, with years of courtroom battles etched into her steady gaze. Before he could retort, a younger officer near the X-ray machine, a woman with wide, nervous eyes and a posture that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else, stepped forward, Her voice trembled slightly, but carried a newfound firmness. "Officer Blake, maybe we should just wrap this up," she said, her hands fidgeting at her sides. "There's no real issue here." Blake's head snapped toward her, his glare a venomous dart that pinned her in place. The young officer's resolve crumbled under the weight of his stare, her shoulders slumping as she retreated into silence. Satisfied, Blake turned back to Jessica, his smirk widening. "You want to file a complaint? Go right ahead," he taunted, his tone laced with a bravado honed by years of dodging accountability. "I've been at this post long enough to know how these little games end." Jessica met his gaze head-on, her dark eyes unyielding, a fortress of calm defiance inside. Her pulse thrummed with a righteous anger, but she kept it leashed, her voice steady as granite. "You're right, Officer Blake. I will be filing a complaint," she said, each word deliberate, heavy with intent. "And I trust the system will deal with it fairly, just as it should deal with anyone who twists their authority into a weapon." For a fleeting second, Blake's smirk wavered, a crack in his armor exposing the doubt beneath. But he quickly masked it, straightening his posture with exaggerated confidence, his chest puffing out as if to reclaim the space her words had stolen. "Do whatever you've got to do," he shot back, his voice gruff but hollow. "I'm just doing my job." Jessica's movements were slow and purposeful as she reached for her briefcase, the soft click of its latch a stark contrast to the chaos simmering around her. She lifted it from the table, her fingers brushing the leather with a quiet reverence, and straightened to her full height. "Then I hope you learn to do it with some shred of integrity," she said, her tone icy but calm. A final arrow loosed before she turned on her heel and walked away. The weight of the confrontation lingered in the air behind her, thick and oppressive, as the murmurs of the other officers swelled into a chorus of hushed speculation. Their whispers carried a nervous energy, as if Jessica's defiance had shattered some unspoken pact of compliance. She crossed the lobby with measured steps, her heels clicking against the floor in a steady rhythm that belied the adrenaline surging through her veins. When she reached a small table near the wall, she set her briefcase down with a deliberate gentleness, a stark counterpoint to the tension still crackling behind her. Blake's smirk flickered as he caught sight of her subtly angling her phone, its tiny red light blinking steadily as it recorded his every move. "Still recording, Judge," he called out, his voice thick with sarcasm, though a faint tremor betrayed his growing unease. Jessica didn't flinch, her gaze locking onto his with an intensity that made the room feel smaller. "Of course," she replied evenly, her words a quiet challenge. "Transparency is the bedrock of justice, isn't it?" Blake stiffened, his eyes darting to the phone, his hand twitching as if he might snatch it away before he thought better of it and stepped back. His bravado was crumbling, piece by piece. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, loud enough for the nearby officers to hear, his voice tinged with a desperation he couldn't quite hide. "You're turning nothing into a damn spectacle." A Passerbia middle-aged man in a rumpled suit slowed his pace, his curiosity piqued by the escalating drama. He raised his own phone, angling it discreetly to capture the standoff, his brow furrowed with a mix of intrigue and disapproval. Blake noticed, his scowl deepening, his composure fraying at the edges. Jessica saw the shift, the way his shoulders tensed, the way his jaw clenched and pressed her advantage. "If there's nothing wrong here, then you shouldn't mind the record," she said, her voice unwavering, a lighthouse cutting through his storm of bluster. Blake's eyes flicked to the small crowd now forming near the security station court staff, visitors, even a janitor leaning on his broom, all watching with rapt attention. His voice sharpened, a frantic bid to wrest back control. "Hand over the phone," he demanded, stepping closer, his shadow looming over her. Jessica didn't budge, her stance rooted like an oak in a gale. "I don't think so," she said, her words forged in steel, unyielding and resolute. Blake's patience snapped like a brittle twig. He lunged for the phone, his fingers outstretched, but Jessica was faster, whisking it out of reach with a fluid grace. Her other hand gripped the table to steady herself as the briefcase teetered precariously, threatening to spill its contents across the floor. The brief struggle sent a ripple of gasps through the onlookers, the tension spiking into something tangible, electric. "Step back," Jessica commanded, her voice ringing out like a gavel, clear and authoritative. Blake froze mid-motion, his outstretched arm hanging awkwardly in the air. The faint click of a camera shutter broke the silencey sound that seemed to jolt him back to reality. He straightened, his face flushing a deep crimson, a volatile mix of rage and humiliation. "You're out of line," he hissed, his voice low and seething, barely containing the fury bubbling beneath. Jessica met his glare without hesitation, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to his unraveling. "I suggest you rethink your choices, officer," she said, her tone measured but firm. "This is being recorded not just by me." Blake's head whipped toward the growing cluster of onlookers. The man with the phone gave a slight, defiant nod, making no effort to hide his intent. Another woman, a courthouse clerk with tired eyes and a stack of files under her arm, had joined the fray, her phone raised too. Blake's expression twisted. The dawning realization hitting him like a punch was no longer the sole arbiter of this moment. His defensiveness surged, and he jabbed a finger at Jessica. "You're blowing this way out of proportion," he snapped, his voice rising. "You think this little performance is going to work? You're not above the law, Judge Carter." She straightened her posture, her presence commanding the room without effort. "I agree completely," she replied, her voice smooth and unshaken. "And neither are you." The murmurs among the officers grew louder, a restless undercurrent of unease. The young woman who'd spoken earlier stepped forward again, her movements cautious, her eyes darting between Blake and Jessica. "Officer Blake, maybe we should," she began, her voice soft but pleading. Blake cut her off with a sharp bark, his frustration boiling over. "Quiet," he snapped, the word echoing through the lobby, silencing the room for a heartbeat. Jessica seized the moment, her gaze steady as she spoke. "If you're so sure your actions are justified, call your supervisor," she said, her tone a challenge wrapped in calm. Blake hesitated, his jaw clenching so tightly it seemed his teeth might crack. "I don't need to call anyone," he growled. "This is my post, and I run it how I see fit." Jessica's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, not triumphant, but resolute. "Then I'll call them myself," she countered, reaching for her phone with a deliberate slowness that dared him to act. Blake's hands shot out, hovering just above her wrist, his fingers trembling with the urge to grab her but stopping short, restrained by the weight of a dozen watching eyes. "Don't," he warned, his voice a low rumble. "You're making this worse for yourself." Jessica tilted her head, her expression one of incredulous amusement. "For myself," she echoed, her tone dripping with irony. "I'm not the one abusing power in front of witnesses." The crowd had swelled, now court staff in crisp suits, visitors clutching manila folders, even a teenage intern with wide eyes and a half-eaten sandwich forgotten in his hand. Phones were raised like lanterns in the dark, their cameras trained on the scene, capturing every flinch, every word. Blake's gaze darted between them and Jessica, his confidence unraveling like a cheap sweater. One of the officers, a weary man with a graying mustache, under his breath. "This isn't going to end well." Blake's lips pressed into a thin, furious line, his breathing heavy and uneven. He took a step back, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "Fine," he spat, the word a bitter concession. "You want the supervisor? I'll get the damn supervisor." Jessica said nothing, letting the silence settle over the room like a judge's ruling. Blake stormed toward the intercom on the wall, his boots slamming against the floor with exaggerated force. He punched in a code, his knuckles white with rage, and barked into the speaker. "Captain Morales, we've got a situation at the front desk. Need you here now." Jessica's gaze followed him, steady and unflinching, though she caught the eye of the young officer lingering near the X-ray machine. The woman offered a fleeting, apologetic glance, her face a canvas of guilt and helplessness melting back into the shadows. Blake returned to the table, his face a mask of barely contained fury. "Satisfied?" he asked, his voice dripping with venom. Jessica didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached for her briefcase, lifted it with a quiet dignity, and stood tall, her expression a portrait of unshakable resolve. The crowd parted slightly as Captain Stephen Morales strode into the room, his presence a sudden shift in the air. Morales's eyes swept over the zenith scattered papers on the table, the phone still clutched in Jessica's hand, the rigid set of Blake's jaw, his brows furrowed. his voice brisk and commanding. "What's going on here?" he demanded, cutting through the lingering tension like a blade. Jessica turned to face him, her movements smooth and deliberate, her voice steady as she spoke. "I believe Officer Blake would like to explain," she said, her tone professional but edged with expectation. Blake opened his mouth, then closed it again, his usual swagger replaced by a visible unease that clung to him like damp cloth. Morales crossed his arms, his patience a thin veneer over his growing impatience, as the room held its breath, waiting for the truth to claw its way to the surface. The lesson here stretched far beyond the clash of egos in that crowded lobby. It was a stark reminder that justice isn't a passive ideal. It demands vigilance, courage, and an unwavering stand against those who wield power as a club rather than a shield. Blake's unraveling wasn't just his own downfall. It was a mirror held up to anyone who forgets that authority comes with a leash, consequences that bite when that leash is ignored. For Jessica, it was a quiet victory, not of vengeance, but of principle, a testament to the enduring strength of integrity in the face of petty tyranny. In the dim, flickering light of the courthouse security checkpoint, Officer Ryan Blake shifted his weight from one foot to the other. His broad shoulders hunched slightly as if the uniform he wore had suddenly grown too tight. A bead of sweat glistened on his forehead, betraying the unease that churned beneath his stoic exterior. "It's just a precautionary measure," he muttered, his voice low and gravelly, as though he were trying to convince himself as much as the woman standing before him. "You know how things have been lately, Judge Carter." Jessica Carter stood tall and unyielding, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun that accentuated the sharpness of her features. Her piercing hazel eyes locked onto Blake, cutting through the flimsy shield of his words like a blade through paper. "Precautionary," she repeated, her tone slicing the air with a mix of disbelief and restrained indignation. She took a measured step closer, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor, each sound a quiet declaration of her presence. "I've passed through this very checkpoint dozens of times, Shunders, even without so much as a raised eyebrow. So tell me, Officer Blake, what's changed today?" Her voice carried the weight of someone who had spent years wielding authority, not just in the courtroom but in every space she occupied. Blake's silence hung heavy, a palpable void that seemed to suck the air from the room. His lips parted slightly, then closed again, as if the words he wanted to summon had abandoned him. His fingers twitched at his sides, curling briefly into fists before relaxing, an unconscious flicker of the frustration simmering within. Captain Morales, a weary man with graying temples and a face etched with the weariness of command, caught the hesitation immediately. He exhaled sharply through his nose, a sound that carried both exasperation and a hint of resignation. Turning to Jessica, he raised a hand in a placating gesture, though his dark eyes betrayed the tension coiling in his chest. "Judge Carter, I hear Yowie do. I get why you're upset, but I've got a team to manage here. Maybe this was just a mix-up, a misunderstanding that got out of hand." Jessica's expression didn't soften. If anything, her jaw tightened, and her gaze grew colder, more resolute. "A misunderstanding," she said, her voice steady but edged with steel. "No, Captain, this wasn't some innocent slip-up, and I'm not here to haggle over personal feelings or vague excuses. This is about an abuse of power, plain and simple. Officer Blake's actions weren't random. They were deliberate, targeted, and I expect them to be addressed with the seriousness they deserve." Her words landed like a gavel, firm and final, leaving no room for negotiation. Blake's face flushed a deep crimson, the color creeping up his neck and settling in his cheeks. His broad jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles twitched beneath the skin. But he held his tongue, his silence a simmering rebellion. Morales took a step back, crossing his arms over his chest, his posture a blend of authority and reluctant surrender. He studied Jessica for a long moment, his brow furrowing as he weighed the gravity of her demand against the fragile balance of his team's morale. "What exactly are you asking for, Judge Carter?" he asked, his voice low, almost cautious, as if he already knew the answer would shift the ground beneath them all. Jessica didn't hesitate. She straightened her shoulders, her briefcase dangling from one hand like a symbol of her unyielding resolve. "I want a formal investigation into Officer Blake's conduct," she declared, her tone unwavering. Not just this incident, but a full review of his interactions with courthouse staff, with visitors, with anyone who's crossed his path here. This isn't about one moment of poor judgment. It's about making damn sure this kind of overreach doesn't happen again. Her words reverberated through the checkpoint, heavy with purpose, a call to justice that refused to be ignored. Morales frowned, his lips pressing into a thin line as he wrestled with the implications. The air grew thick with unspoken tension, the murmur of nearby officers fading into a hushed backdrop. Jessica's voice softened slightly, though it lost none of its strength. "Captain, I know you're under pressure more than most, but sweeping this under the rug won't make it vanish. Facing it head-on, holding people accountable, that's what keeps this place from crumbling under its own weight." She held his gaze, her eyes searching his for a flicker of understanding, a sign that he grasped the deeper stakes at play. Morales studied her in return, his weathered face unreadable for a moment longer. Then, with a slow nod, he relented. "Fine," he said, his voice clipped but firm. He turned to Blake, whose posture had stiffened like a coiled spring. "Officer Blake, you're to stand down for the rest of the day. I'll take it from here." Blake's mouth opened, a protest forming on his lips, but Morales cut him off with a sharp glare. "That's an order." Jessica's gaze didn't waver, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the storm brewing in Blake's eyes. "I also expect a formal apology," she added, her words a quiet demand that carried the force of a command. Morales turned back to Blake, his expression hardening into something unyielding. "Officer, apologize to Judge Carter, now." Blake's fists clenched tighter, his knuckles whitening as he fought to keep his composure. His chest rose and fell with a heavy breath, and when he finally spoke, the words came out like shards of glass, jagged and forced. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice flat, stripped of any trace of genuine remorse. The apology lingered in the air, hollow and brittle, a gesture that satisfied no one. Jessica tilted her head slightly, her lips curving into the faintest hint of a smile, not one of triumph, but of quiet resolve. "I appreciate the gesture, Captain," she said, her tone measured, but the sincerity's lacking. "I trust the investigation will dig deeper than empty words." Morales nodded again, his professionalism strained under the weight of her unshakable stance. "You have my word, Judge Carter," he replied, his voice carrying a reluctant promise. "Good," Jessica said simply. She picked up her briefcase, the leather creaking softly in her grip, and turned to leave. As she walked away, the murmur of voices swelled behind her, a chorus of whispers and stifled opinions rising like a tide. The tension in the room remained palpable, a living thing that pulsed through the gathered officers. Some shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Blake and the retreating figure of the judge, while others stood with arms crossed, their faces masks of indifference or quiet defiance. Blake remained rooted to the spot, his jaw locked tight, his broad frame radiating a fury he could barely contain. "I'm sorry," he muttered again, louder this time, though the words still dripped with resentment. Jessica paused mid-step, turning her head just enough to meet his gaze. "Would you care to repeat that, Officer Blake?" she asked, her voice calm but laced with an unspoken challenge. He shifted his weight, his hands flexing at his sides as Morales's stern glare bore into him. "I said I'm sorry," Blake repeated, his tone rising with forced clarity. Though the fire in his eyes betrayed his true feelings, Jessica regarded him coolly. "For what, exactly?" she pressed, her words a scalpel dissecting his flimsy defense. "For the misunderstanding," Blake replied, each syllable carefully measured, laced with a hostility he couldn't fully mask. His face burned with frustration, the flush deepening as he struggled to hold her gaze. Jessica's eyes narrowed, her voice cutting through the air like a whip. "A misunderstanding, not for the inappropriate, unprofessional behavior you displayed, not for the selective enforcement of your so-called protocol." Blake opened his mouth to retort, but no sound came. His silence spoke louder than any words, a confession of guilt he refused to voice. The murmurs among the officers grew louder, a restless hum that filled the space. Some exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort palpable, while others offered subtle nods in Blake's direction, their loyalty a quiet undercurrent in the room. A young officer named Daniels, lanky and wide-eyed, shifted nervously near the back, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his badge as he watched the scene unfold. Another, a grizzled veteran named Hargrove, leaned against the wall, his arms folded and his weathered face set in a scowl, though his eyes flickered with grudging respect for Jessica's tenacity. Jessica's gaze swept over the group, lingering for a moment on the varied reactions before returning to Blake. "An apology without accountability is meaningless," she said, her voice ringing clear and sharp. "It's actions, not empty words, that prove integrity." Blake bristled, his composure cracking as his hands balled into fists once more. "I've already apologized," he snapped, his voice rising with a raw edge. "What more do you want?" She stepped closer, her posture radiating authority, her presence filling the room. "I want you to understand the weight of what you did," she said, her tone low but unyielding. "I want you to see that undermining someone's authority out of spite, out of bias, out of whatever petty grudge you're nursing isn't just disrespectful. It's dangerous. It erodes trust, it fractures justice, and it puts everyone at risk." Blake's lips tightened into a thin, angry line, his frustration boiling just beneath the surface. "You think I was biased?" He shot back, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. "Maybe I was just doing my job." "If you were doing your job," Jessica replied, her words swift and cutting, "you wouldn't need to hide behind excuses. A true professional doesn't rely on half-truths or deflections. They stand by their actions. Right or wrong." Her eyes bored into him, daring him to challenge her further. Morales cleared his throat, stepping slightly between them, his weary frame a fragile barrier against the escalating tension. "That's enough," he said, his voice firm but tinged with exhaustion. "Judge Carter, the apology's been made. I'll make sure this is handled properly." He turned to Jessica, meeting her unwavering gaze with a nod. "You have my assurance." Jessica studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "I trust you will, Captain," she said, her voice steady. "Because if this is the kind of behavior you tolerate under your command, then this problem runs deeper than one officer. It's a rock that threatens everything we stand for." The room fell silent, her words settling over the crowd like a heavy fog, each syllable a reminder of the stakes beyond this single confrontation. Blake broke the quiet, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Guess I'll just be the example for everyone else." His eyes glinted with defiance, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Jessica didn't flinch. "If holding you accountable sets an example, then so be it," she replied coolly. "But understand this, Officer Blake, you're the one who lit this fuse, not me." Her words were a quiet thunder, reverberating with the weight of consequence. Blake shook his head, muttering something under his breath, the words too low to catch but thick with venom. "Speak up," Jessica said, her tone icy. "If you've got something to say, let everyone hear it." He glared at her, his defiance flickering like a dying flame, but he held his silence. Morales stepped in fully this time, his voice weary but resolute. "Blake, that's enough. You're dismissed for the day. I'll deal with you later." Blake hesitated, his broad shoulders tensing one last time, but the command in Morales's tone left no room for argument. He turned on his heel, his boots thudding against the floor with each heavy step, his frustration trailing behind him like a shadow. Jessica watched him go, her expression unreadable, then turned back to Morales. "Captain, I'll be following up on this investigation personally," she said, her voice softening slightly, though her resolve remained ironclad. Morales nodded, his face grim. "Understood, Judge Carter. I'll keep you updated." "Good," she replied, adjusting her grip on her briefcase. "I want to see this institution rise to the standards we claim to uphold, not just in words, but in deeds." Morales didn't respond immediately, but his slow nod carried a weight of reluctant agreement, a silent acknowledgement of the truth in her words. As Jessica stepped away from the security area, the murmurs resumed behind her, fragmented snippets of conversation drifting through the air. "Can you believe she pushed it that far?" one officer whispered, his tone a mix of awe and disbelief. "Blake's always been like that. It was bound to happen." Another muttered, shaking his head. "She's got guts, I'll give her that." A third added, her voice tinged with grudging admiration. Jessica didn't look back, but the words lingered in her mind, a faint echo of the battle she'd just fought, The confrontation faded into memory as she moved toward the courtroom, but its bitterness clung to her like damp air. Blake's half-hearted apology had been a fleeting, hollow victory far from the true accountability she sought. Justice, she knew, wasn't won in a single moment. It was a relentless pursuit, a fire that demanded constant tending. And as she stepped into the packed courtroom, the air thick with anticipation, she carried that fire with her. The gallery buzzed with restless energy as Jessica ascended to the bench, her robes settling around her like a mantle of authority. The high-profile sentencing before her a well-known entrepreneur convicted of fraud had drawn a crowd, their whispers rippling through the room like waves. Yet it wasn't just the case that fueled the tension. The morning's clash at the checkpoint lingered like a specter, its shadow stretching across the space. "That's her," a voice hissed from the back, sharp and conspiratorial. "Blake's going to hate this." Another muttered, barely audible. Jessica's sharp gaze swept the crowd, silencing the murmurs with the weight of her presence. She settled into her seat, her hands resting lightly on the bench, and turned her attention to the docket. "All rise," the bailiff intoned, his voice cutting through the hush. The room stood as one, the rustle of fabric and creak of benches filling the silence. Jessica nodded. "You may be seated." Before her stood Marcus Bennett, the defense counsel, a man known for his razor-sharp tactics and theatrical flair. He rose from his seat, adjusting his tie with deliberate precision, his movements smooth and calculated. "Your Honor," he began, his voice a polished drawl, "before we proceed, I must address." But Jessica's mind lingered briefly on the morning's events, the lesson of justice and the cost of unchecked power burning bright within her. This courtroom, this case seat was another battleground, another chance to uphold the principles she'd fought for at the checkpoint, and she was ready. Jessica Carter's eyes narrowed into thin slits as she fixed her gaze on Mr. Bennett, her heartbeat a steady drum against her ribs. The courtroom air felt thick, charged with anticipation, as she waited for him to continue. "Go on." "Mr. Bennett," she prompted, her voice slicing through the hum of the room like a blade. Bennett, standing tall with his shoulders squared, cast a deliberate glance toward the gallery, his sharp eyes scanning the rows of onlookers. He paused, savoring the weight of their attention, ensuring every head was turned his way before he spoke again. "It has come to my notice," he began, his tone smooth yet edged with intent, "that an incident occurred this morning between you, Your Honor, and courthouse security." The words landed like a spark on dry grass, igniting a ripple of murmurs that rolled through the crowd. Jessica's jaw clenched, the muscles tightening as she fought to keep her composure. Her fingers gripped the edge of the bench, the cool wood grounding her as she leaned forward slightly. "This hearing," she said, her voice crisp and unyielding, "is about the defendant, Mr. Bennett, not me. I suggest you keep your focus where it belongs." Bennett's lips twitched into a faint smirk, and with an exaggerated dip of his head, he replied, "Of course, Your Honor," yet his tone carried a hint of mockery, a subtle challenge woven into his deference. "But as an advocate for my client, I am compelled to scold such an event. So close to these proceedings, cast a shadow over the impartiality we all hold dear." Jessica's chest tightened, not from doubt but from the audacity of his insinuation. She straightened, her dark eyes locking onto his with a fierceness that could have pinned him to the wall. "Impartiality is the bedrock of this bench, Mr. Bennett," she declared, each word deliberate, resonant. "I assure you, nothing that transpired this morning will sway my ability to deliver justice fairly." Her voice was a steel beam, unshakable, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Bennett raised his hands, palms up in a gesture of mock surrender, his fingers splaying wide as if to ward off her resolve. "I only wish to safeguard my client's rights, Your Honor," he said, his voice dipping into a performative humility. "After all, doesn't perception matter just as much as reality?" Jessica's expression hardened, her lips pressing into a thin line as she felt a flicker of irritation flare within her. "This court," she countered, her tone now a low, controlled burn, "runs on facts and the law not fleeting perceptions. Let's move forward." For a fleeting moment, Bennett hesitated, his confident facade faltering as his eyes darted to the side. Then, with a curt nod, he retreated to his seat, the wooden chair creaking faintly under his weight as he settled. The prosecution took the floor, their lead attorney rising with a stack of notes clutched in hand. He began to unravel the defendant's crimes fraud that had shattered the lives of dozens of small business owners, leaving behind a trail of broken dreams and empty bank accounts. Jessica listened, her pen moving swiftly across her notepad, capturing every detail. The gallery sat in rapt silence, the only sounds the rustle of paper or the occasional shift of a restless foot against the polished floor. The weight of the testimony pressed down on the room, a somber reminder of the human cost tied to the case. When it was the defense's turn, Bennett surged to his feet with a vigor that bordered on theatrical, his suit jacket flapping slightly as he strode toward the bench. "Your Honor," he began, his voice booming with a preacher's cadence. "My client is not a perfect man." He paced deliberately, his polished shoes clicking against the hardwood, each step a calculated beat in his performance. But perfection isn't the yardstick of justice, redemption is. He spun a tale then, his words weaving a vivid tapestry of a man flawed yet striving for atonement. The defendant, he argued, was not a villain, but a soul caught in a moment of weakness, now desperate to right his wrongs. Bennett's delivery was flawless, his gestures grand yet precise, his voice rising and falling like a symphony. Yet Jessica sat unmoved, her face a mask of stone as she watched him, her mind sifting through his eloquence to the cold facts beneath. When he finally took his seat, his chest heaving slightly from the effort, Jessica let the silence linger, a heavy pause that seemed to press against the walls. Then she spoke, her voice cutting through the stillness with crystalline clarity. "Mr. Bennett, your argument is duly noted. However, this court must consider the wreckage your client's actions left behind lives upended. Trust shattered." She turned her gaze to the defendant, Mr. Loring, who rose slowly from his chair. His posture was hunched, his hands clasped tightly before him, a picture of contrition carefully crafted. "Your Honor," he said, his voice soft but measured, "I deeply regret what I've done. Every day since my conviction, I've thought of those I've harmed, of how I can make amends." Jessica studied him, her eyes tracing the rehearsed rhythm of his speech, the slight tremor in his hands that betrayed his nerves. When he finished, she let the quiet stretch again, her mind turning over his words like stones in a riverbed. "The law is clear," she began at last, her tone steady as granite. "Remorse is a virtue, Mr. Loring, but accountability is its backbone. Your actions inflicted wounds that cannot be undone, and this court must reflect that truth in its judgment." Her sentence was firm, yet balanced, a punishment that acknowledged his regret, but refused to erase the consequences, leaving both sides restless yet resigned. As the bailiff led Loring away, his footsteps echoing faintly, the gallery erupted into a chorus of hushed whispers. Jessica rose, her gavel striking the bench with a sharp crack that silenced the room. "This court is adjourned," she declared, stepping down with a grace that belied the storm brewing within her. The bailiff approached as she gathered her robes, his broad frame filling the space near the bench. "Judge Carter," he said, his voice low and urgent, "Captain Morales requests a meeting in your chambers. He says it's pressing." Jessica nodded, her focus shifting like gears in a machine. Whatever Morales wanted, she suspected it was no trivial matter. She made her way to her chambers, the hallway stretching long and dim before her, the faint hum of the courthouse fading into the background. Settling at her desk, she flipped through her sentencing notes, the ink blurring slightly as her mind replayed the day's events. A knock rattled the door, and without lifting her eyes, she called, "Come in." Captain Stephen Morales stepped inside, his uniform crisp, his head clutched in one hand as he hovered near the threshold. His face was a careful mask, neutrality etched into every line. "Judge Carter," he said, his voice even but weighted, "thank you for seeing me." She gestured to the chair across her desk, her movements brisk. "Take a seat, Captain." Morales sat, his spine rigid, his hat resting awkwardly in his lap. "I'm here to apologize formally," he began, his words measured as if stepping through a minefield, "on behalf of the courthouse security team for this morning's incident. It was unprofessional, and it doesn't reflect the standards we aim to uphold." Jessica leaned back, her arms crossing as she studied him, her gaze piercing through his composure. "I appreciate the sentiment, Captain," she replied, her tone cool, but apologies without follow-through are hollow. What's being done to prevent this from happening again? Morales hesitated, his fingers tightening around the brim of his hat, the leather creaking faintly. I understand your frustration, Judge, he said, his voice dipping slightly. If I may offer some context, Officer Blake has been under immense pressure. We've been short-staffed for weeks, and the strain has worn everyone thin. Jessica's expression remained unyielding, her brow arching slightly. Stress is no excuse for unprofessionalism or prejudice, Captain, she said, her words sharp yet controlled. You and I both know that. Morales exhaled, a quick, frustrated breath that flared his nostrils. I'm not excusing it, he countered, but it might explain why tensions boiled over this morning. Blake's a solid officer professional, usually. This wasn't like him. Jessica leaned forward, her elbows resting on the desk, her voice dropping to a steely whisper. If it was so out of character, why didn't his colleagues intervene? Why did it take me pulling out my phone to record it for accountability to kick in? This isn't just about one man's lapse, Captain, it's about a culture that lets it slide. Morales shifted, his broad shoulders hunching slightly as discomfort crept into his frame. I can't police every moment, he admitted, his tone gruff. People slip up. Jessica's eyes flashed. And what happens when those slip-ups chip away at public trust? She pressed. This courthouse isn't just brick and mortar, it's a promise of justice. Everyone who steps through those doors deserves respect, no matter who they are. Morales sighed again, setting his hat on his knee as he met her gaze. What do you want from me, Judge Carter? He asked, his voice raw with exhaustion. More than words and wrist slaps, she replied, her tone firm as iron. I want real change, irregular training on bias and conduct, a clear system for reporting and tackling misconduct, and proof you're building a culture where this doesn't fester. Morales frowned, his thick brows knitting together. That's a big ask, he said, his voice low. Jessica's stare didn't waver. It's not negotiable. If we're serious about justice, we can't let rot spread in our own house. Silence fell, heavy and thick, as Morales leaned back, his eyes drifting to the floor. After a long beat, he spoke, his voice softer, reflective. You're right, he said. This isn't just about Blake. We've gotten too comfortable, and that's on me. It has to shift. Jessica nodded, a flicker of approval softening her features. Then let's start now, she said. Blake's actions this morning were indefensible. He needed addressing, pronto. But this isn't just about punishment, it's about setting a bar. Morales straightened, resolve hardening his jaw. I'll suspend Blake pending a full review, he said, and I'll draft plans for training and policy overhauls. It's a start. Jessica's tone eased, though her eyes remained vigilant. It's a good first step, Captain, but I'll be watching. If I don't see real movement, I won't hesitate to take this higher. Morales met her gaze, a spark of respect breaking through his weathered exterior. You've got my word, Judge Carter. I'll make it right. She nodded, her expression resolute. See that you do. As he stood to leave, he paused at the door, turning back. For what it's worth, he said, his voice quieter, I admire your fire. This place needs more like you. Jessica didn't reply immediately, letting his words drift in the air. Let's make sure that fire catches on with everyone who works here, she said finally. Morales gave a single nod before stepping out, the door clicking shut behind him. Alone again, Jessica turned back to her notes, but her thoughts churned like a restless sea. Morales's promise was a foothold, but she knew the climb ahead was steep. Uprooting a culture tangled in complacency and bias wouldn't bend to mere words. It demanded grit, vigilance, and a relentless push against the tide. The silence in her chambers pressed against her, thick and unyielding, as she sat at her desk, the open folder before her a blur of ink and memory. The day's adrenaline had ebbed, leaving behind a hollow ache, a quiet storm of doubts and echoes from years past. As a young lawyer, fresh from law school, she'd stepped into courtrooms where power flexed unchecked, where justice bent under the weight of influence. Those lessons had forged her, hardened her into the judge she was now, who saw every breach, every crack, as a call to stand firm. Blake's lapse, Morales's half-steps, Bennett's theatrics, they were all threads in a larger tapestry, a warning of what happened when authority forgot its purpose. Justice wasn't just a verdict, it was a living, breathing fight, and she'd wage it with every breath she had. The courtroom buzzed with the low murmur of spectators as Jessica Carter stood at the forefront, her posture unwavering, her navy suit crisp against the muted tones of the oak-paneled walls. She had spent years carving out her place here, earning the title of lead counsel through late nights and relentless determination. Yet, in that moment, the Judea man whose graying hair and stern demeanor commanded the room turned not to her, but to her male colleague seated beside her. His words, clipped and authoritative, bypassed her entirely, as if she were a shadow rather than the driving force of the case. Her chest tightened, a flicker of indignation sparking beneath her composed exterior. She cleared her throat, her voice steady but firm as she interjected, "Your Honor, I'm the lead counsel here." The judge's eyes flicked to her, narrowing slightly, and his lips curled into a patronizing smirk. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Miss Carter," he drawled, his tone dripping with condescension. Laughter rippled through the gallery, sharp, mocking, a sound that clawed at her dignity. She forced a tight smile, her jaw clenching as she nodded politely, refusing to let the humiliation crack her resolve. But inside, the sting burrowed deep, a wound that pulsed even now, hours later. As she sat alone in her dimly lit office, Jessica's fingers tightened around the pen in her hand, the cool metal grounding her as the memory ebbed. That day had been a turning point, a quiet vow etched into her soul. She had promised herself she'd never let another woman feel so small, so dismissed, in a space where they'd fought tooth and nail to belong. The weight of that promise hung over her now, heavy and unyielding. As she stared at the scattered papers on her desk, had she made a dent in that vow, or was she just swinging at shadows, battling the same injustices dressed up in different disguises? Her mind drifted to earlier that day, to Ryan Blake, Officer Blake, his hollow apology still echoing in her ears. His words had been laced with resentment, not regret. His voice rough and defensive as he stood before her in the courthouse corridor. She could still see the defiance blazing in his hazel eyes, the way his broad shoulders tensed as if bracing for a fight. She'd held her ground, her chin lifted, her gaze unflinching, refusing to let him chip away at her authority. But as the confrontation faded, doubt crept in. Had her defiance shifted anything meaningful, or had she merely skimmed the surface of a system too entrenched to budge? The question gnawed at her, a persistent ache she couldn't shake. She exhaled slowly, her breath fogging faintly in the cool air of her office, and felt her resolve harden like steel cooling after the forge. One standoff wasn't enough, she knew that in her bones. True justice, the kind that rewrote the rules and dismantled the rot, demanded more than a single act of courage. It required cunning, endurance, a willingness to stare down resistance and keep going when the odds stacked against her. How many more clashes like this would it take, she wondered, before the tide turned? How many times would she have to grit her teeth through the smirks, the slights, the subtle reminders that power could twist fairness into a weapon? She reached for her notebook, its leather cover worn from years of use, and flipped to a fresh page. The pen scratched against the paper as she poured out her thoughts. Ideas she'd hashed out with Morales, her sharp-witted colleague who shared her fire for reform. Training programs to root out bias, stricter accountability measures, a clear pipeline for reporting misconduct without fear of retaliation. These were the seeds of change, practical steps to drag the system into the light. She paused, tapping the pen against the desk, the rhythm steadying her racing mind. These were vital, yes, but they were just the first bricks in a foundation that needed to stretch far deeper. Her phone buzzed, jolting her from her reverie. The screen glowing with a message from her law school mentor. "Saw the video from this morning. Proud of you. Keep going." Jessica's breath caught as she stared at the words, her thumb hovering over the screen. The video nearly forgotten. A bystander had captured the whole ugly scene with Blake. The shaky footage likely spiraling across social media by now, hashtags blooming like wildfire. Her stomach twisted at the thought. Public attention could be a spark, igniting pressure for reform, amplifying her voice beyond the courthouse walls. But it was a fickle ally capable of fueling progress or hardening the resistance she already faced. She could still feel the heat of the moment, Blake lunging for her phone, his face flushed with fury as he realized his actions were being etched into permanence. His outstretched hand had faltered midair, his growl of frustration morphing into something sharper fear. Not just anger, but the raw, visceral dread of exposure, of consequences he couldn't outrun. That fear, Jessica realized, was a crack in the armor, a sign that the ground was shifting. However slightly, it wasn't comfortable and never wasped it forced people to face the mirror, to reckon with the weight of their choices. She turned back to her notebook, the pen hovering before she added a new line in bold strokes. Cultural change demands discomfort. The words felt right, solid, but another thought struck her, sharp and insistent. What about the others in that corridor? The officers who'd stood by, their faces blank as stone, their silence louder than Blake's outburst? She pictured the young woman among Theme Officer Daniels, her name tag glinting under the fluorescent light, her lips parting as if to speak, only to snap shut under Blake's withering glare. Jessica's brow furrowed as she recalled the whispers rippling through the group, the sit-along glances, the tension that hung like smoke. Were they complicit, these bystanders, or were they shackled by a system that punished dissent with isolation, with whispered threats of ruined careers? She snapped the notebook shut, her expression darkening. If she wanted to uproot the rot, it wasn't enough to hold men like Blake accountable. She had to ignite the courage in those who watched, to give them the tools and the will to step into the fray. Justice wasn't just about punishing the loudest wrongs, it was about awakening the quiet ones too. Her gaze drifted to the towering stack of case files on her desk, their edges curling from neglect, a silent testament to the grind awaiting her tomorrow. Justice wasn't some lofty dream, it was a slog, a daily wrestle with hard calls and messy outcomes. Yet, beneath the exhaustion, a spark flared anew. She rose from her chair, the creak of the leather seat echoing in the stillness, and gathered her things with deliberate care. As she reached for her briefcase, a soft knock startled her. The door edged open, and her clerk, Tim, poked his head in, his weary frame hesitant in the threshold. "Judge Carter, everything okay?" His voice was tentative, his brown eyes flicking to the open notebook on her desk. She managed a small smile, the corners of her lips lifting despite the weight in her chest. "Yes, just wrapping up. Long day." He nodded, lingering a moment. "You handled it well out there." "Takes guts." Her smile faded as he slipped away, the door clicking shut. Guts, she turned the word over in her mind as she stepped into the crisp evening air, the courthouse looming behind her like a monolith. It wasn't about courage, it was about survival, about clawing toward a world that didn't bend so easily to arrogance and abuse. The parking lot stretched out before her, bathed in the dim glow of sodium lights, the faint hum of voices tugging at her attention. Near her car, a figure peeled away from the shadows. Rian Blake, leaning against the lamppost, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His uniform was creased, his posture rigid as he straightened at her approach. Jessica's steps didn't waver, her face a mask of calm as she stopped a few feet away. "Officer Blake," she said, her tone even, laced with a quiet strength. "Judge Carter," he replied, his voice low, roughened by the day's strain. Silence stretched between them, thick and electric, the air crackling with everything left unsaid. Blake shifted, his jaw tightening before he spoke. "I wasn't expecting to see you out here." "Likewise," she countered, her eyes steady, pinning him in place. "Is there something you need?" He hesitated, his shoulders stiffening, then looked away, the lamplight casting harsh shadows across his face. "I wanted to clear the air." Jessica arched an eyebrow, her expression unyielding. "Go on." Blake's gaze darted back to her, his hands flexing at his sides. "I stand by the job I do," he said, his voice gaining an edge. "But today I might have gone too far." "Might have." Her words cut through the night, sharp and deliberate. He flinched, a muscle twitching in his cheek, but pressed on. "I don't like being painted as the villain. I was doing what I thought was right." "What you thought was right," she echoed, her tone hardening. "And what about what was fair? What about what was professional?" Blake's mouth opened, then shut, a heavy sigh escaping him. "I don't know. Maybe I messed up. Maybe I let it spiral." She stepped closer, her presence commanding despite the fatigue tugging at her edges. "Acknowledging a mistake is a start, Officer Blake. But understanding why it happened, committing to change it, that's what counts." He nodded slowly, something shifting in his eyes, not quite remorse, but a glimmer of reckoning. Think about it, she said, her voice firm, unyielding. Do more than think. Do better. Blake met her gaze, the defiance softening, if only for a moment, before he turned and walked away, his boots scuffing against the asphalt. Jessica stood alone in the fading light, the weight of the day settling over her like a mantle. She unlocked her car, slid into the driver's seat, and let out a deep, steadying breath. Today had been a skirmishon of countless to come, but it wasn't the end. Tomorrow would dawn with fresh battles, new chances to chip away at the stone of injustice. As she started the engine, the hum of it steady beneath her hands, she felt the ember of purpose flare brighter. The road ahead was long, but Jessica Carter was ready to fight, to persist, to turn discomfort into progress, one relentless step at a time. The air hung heavy between them, thick with the unspoken weight of their confrontation. Jessica Carter stood tall, her posture unyielding, her sharp eyes boring into Officer Ryan Blake as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cracked asphalt of the courthouse parking lot. Her voice sliced through the stillness, crisp and unrelenting. Authority doesn't automatically earn you respect, Blake, she said, cutting him off mid-sentence. Her tone edged with a fierceness born of years spent clawing her way through disrespect and doubt. Do you honestly believe I haven't faced my own battles? That I haven't had to fight with everything I've got every single day to carve out the respect I hold now? Her words weren't just a rebuke. They were a mirror, reflecting her own jagged journey through a world that often refused to see her worth. Blake's jaw tightened, his lips parting as if to argue, but the sound never came. He clamped his mouth shut, his hazel eyes flickering with a mix of defiance and uncertainty. His boots scuffed against the pavement, a restless shuffle that betrayed the storm brewing inside him. Jessica didn't relent. She stepped closer, her voice steady as steel. This isn't about you feeling like no one's got your back. This is about you taking that frustration and wielding it like a weapon to tear someone else down. Do you even see the difference? Her question lingered, sharp and pointed, demanding more than a simple answer. It demanded introspection, something Blake clearly wasn't prepared to give. He shifted again, his broad shoulders hunching slightly as his gaze dropped to the ground. The asphalt beneath his feet was weathered and worn, much like the excuses he muttered under his breath. I didn't mean it like that, he said, his voice low, almost swallowed by the hum of distant traffic. I wasn't thinking straight. It felt like you were coming at me, challenging me, trying to make me look small in front of everyone. His words stumbled out, raw and unpolished, revealing a man caught between pride and shame. Jessica's expression didn't soften, but her eyes narrowed slightly, pinning him in place. I wasn't trying to make you look bad, Officer Blake, she said, her tone firm yet laced with an undercurrent of exasperation. You managed that all by yourself, and instead of facing it, owning up to what you did, you dig your heels in deeper. That's the part that has to stop. Blake's head snapped up, his eyes flashing with a spark of defiance. It's not that easy, Jessica. He shot back, his voice rising with a frustration that had been simmering too long. You think I don't want to be better, that I don't want to fix things. This whole system, it's a mess. It's broken, and people like me, we're the ones who get chewed up in it, stuck between the rules and the reality. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, his knuckles whitening as he wrestled with the weight of his own words. He wasn't wrong about the system. Jessica knew that better than most, but she also knew it was no excuse for his actions. Her tone softened, but only just, her words still precise, cutting through his defensiveness like a surgeon's scalpel. Then stop complaining and start fixing it, Blake. Start with yourself. Look at what you did, at the biases you carry, at how you treat the people around you. Don't let a broken system be your shield for bad behavior, yours or anyone else's. She watched as her words landed, each one a pebble dropped into the still waters of his conscience, rippling outward. Blake's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him, leaving behind a man who looked suddenly smaller, more human. You make it sound so simple, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper, tinged with a bitterness that spoke of sleepless nights and endless doubts. It's not. Jessica didn't flinch. No, it's not simple, she agreed, her gaze unwavering. But it's necessary. The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. As the two stood locked in a moment neither could easily escape. Blake's face twisted, his frustration giving way to something quieter, something that looked almost like reflection. He nodded, a small, reluctant gesture, as if the weight of her words had finally settled into his bones. "I'll think about it," he said, his voice rough but sincere. Her eyes hardened, unrelenting. "Thinking's not enough, Officer Blake. Show me with your actions, not just empty words." He hesitated, then extended a hand. An olive branch offered with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "I'll try," he said, his tone carrying the faintest promise. "That's all I can give you right now." Jessica didn't take his hand. Instead, she met his gaze squarely, her silence louder than any response. "I don't need promises, Officer Blake," she said, her voice steady and resolute. "I need results." Blake's hand fell slowly to his side, his expression a mix of deflation and determination. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his footsteps heavy but deliberate, echoing faintly against the concrete as he disappeared into the fading light. Jessica watched him go, her chest tight with a blend of resolve and cautious hope. She unlocked her car, the click of the key fob sharp in the stillness, and slid into the driver's seat. As the door thudded shut, she exhaled, letting the tension seep out of her. She knew she'd planted a seed in Blake's fragile, uncertain thing. Whether it would take root and grow, or wither under the weight of his own resistance, was entirely up to him. By the next morning, the courthouse buzzed with an electric undercurrent, the usual rhythm of footsteps and murmured greetings replaced by hushed whispers and stolen glances. Jessica Carter moved through the marble-lined halls, her heels clicking against the polished floor with a steady, unhurried cadence. The weight of the previous day clung to her like a second skin, but she carried it with the same quiet strength that had brought her this far. Word of her clash with Blake had spread like wildfire, fueled by a grainy cell phone video captured by a passerby. Overnight, it had exploded online, racking up thousands of views, likes, and heated comments that dissected every frame. Blake's aggressive lunge for her phone, her calm defiance in the face of his temper. The footage had turned a private confrontation into a public spectacle, igniting debates that rippled far beyond the courthouse walls. In the break room, a junior clerk named Mia leaned against the counter, her voice low but animated as she spoke to her colleague, Sam. "Did you see that video?" She didn't even flinch, Mia said, her dark eyes wide with admiration. "Not for a second." Sam, stirring sugar into his coffee, nodded grimly. She shouldn't have had to deal with that at all. Blake was way out of line grabbing for her phone like that. "Who does he think he is?" Their words were a quiet chorus of support, a small but growing echo of the sentiment Jessica had stirred. Not everyone agreed. In the courtroom waiting area, two older attorneys, grizzled veterans of the legal world, sat hunched over their briefcases, their voices thick with skepticism. "She could have handled it differently," one said. A man named Harold with silver hair and a perpetual frown. He shook his head, his fingers drumming against the armrest. "Did she really need to record him? That's just pouring gas on the fire." His companion, a weary man named Paul, nodded in agreement. "Exactly. Jessica Carter's a solid judge, no question, but she pushes too hard sometimes. She's going to make enemies if she keeps this up. People don't like being called out like that." Their words carried the weight of tradition, a resistance to the discomfort of change. Meanwhile, near the filing room, a cluster of younger interns gathered, their voices bright with a different energy. "She's a role model, honestly," said Priya, a law student with a sharp mind and sharper ambition. "Most people would have backed down, but she stood her ground." Another intern, a lanky kid named Ethan, nodded eagerly. "It's about time someone shook things up around here. The power imbalance's been ignored forever. She's making people squirm because they don't want to face what's really going on." Their admiration was palpable, a spark of hope in a place often dulled by routine. Jessica stepped into her chambers, the door creaking softly as it swung shut behind her. Her clerk, a young man named Daniel with a perpetually worried brow, greeted her with a tablet outstretched. "Judge Carter," he said, his voice tentative, "you're going viral." She took the device, her fingers brushing the cool screen as she scrolled through the flood of comments. Beneath the video, the opinions were a chaotic tapestry. Some lauded her as a beacon of courage. Others sneered at her as a troublemaker. She's an inspiration. Finally, someone standing up to power trips. One read. Another spat venom. Typical, always making it about gender and race. A third kept it simple. The officer was wrong. She handled it perfectly. And yet another grumbled. Was she making a scene instead of doing her job? Jessica set the tablet down, her face a mask of calm. Though her mind churned with the implications, it was bound to happen, she said, her voice steady, betraying none of the storm within. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Most of the staff here are behind you, he offered. But not everyone. Jessica's lips quirked faintly, not quite a smile. I'm aware, she replied, her tone measured. And I don't need everyone to like me, Daniel. I need results. Later that day, Captain Morales, a broad-shouldered man with a voice like gravel, called an emergency meeting. The courthouse leadership filed into a cramped conference room, the air thick with tension. Jessica sat near the edge, her presence quiet but commanding, her eyes scanning the faces around her, some supportive, others wary. Morales stood at the front, his hands clasped behind his back. We all know why we're here, he began, his tone steady but heavy with gravity. What happened between Judge Carter and Officer Blake has put a spotlight on problems. We can't ignore any more EBIAs. Professionalism, accountability. These aren't just words, they're challenges we have to face head-on. A senior administrator, a weary man named Richard with a pinched expression, raised a hand. With all due respect, Captain, he said, his voice clipped, aren't we overreacting? Things like this happen all the time. Was this one special? Jessica leaned forward, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. Because it was caught on camera, Richard. Because the public's watching now, and they won't let us bury it. That's why it's different. Richard's frown deepened, his fingers tapping the table. So we're only dealing with this because people are loud about it. Jessica didn't blink. I'm saying this isn't just one moment, it's a sign of bigger cracks. Pretending they don't exist won't fix them. It'll only make them worse. Morales nodded, stepping in to guide the discussion. Judge Carter's right. This isn't about one incident, it's about building a place where respect and responsibility aren't just ideals, they're the baseline. By the meeting's end, a plan took shape, mandatory training on bias and de-escalation, a clearer process for reporting misconduct, a review of security protocols. It was a start. But Jessica knew the real fight lay ahead. Turning words into action was a steep climb, especially with voices like Richard's dragging their feet. As she left, she caught snippets of conversation from the junior staff members lingering in the hall. Do you think anything's really going to change? One asked, her voice tinged with doubt. The other, a young woman with fierce eyes, replied, It has to. People like Judge Carter won't let it drop. Jessica paused, their words sinking into her like roots into soil. She didn't see herself as a hero or a crusader, just a woman who understood the cost of silence. If she didn't push, who would? Back in her chambers, she stared out the window at the courthouse lawn, the world beyond shifting slowly under the pressure of her actions. Some clung to the old ways, their resistance a heavy anchor. Others embraced the unease, seeing it as the first step toward something better. The path forward stretched long and treacherous, but Jessica was ready. The spark had ignited. Now came the harder task, fanning it into a flame that wouldn't flicker out. Days later, she stood before a packed room of courthouse officials, attorneys, and department heads. The air crackled with anticipation, every eye fixed on her. Captain Morales sat near the front, his jaw tight, a stack of printed proposals laid out before him. Jessica took a deep breath, her voice ringing clear and firm. What happened last week wasn't just a flare-up. It was a window into problems we've let fester too long. Issues of justice, of power, of accountability. Today, we start fixing them. She laid out the reforms with precision. Training to confront bias, stricter rules for handling complaints, oversight to keep security in check. The room listened, some nodding, others shifting uncomfortably. Halfway through, a hand shot up. Judge Alan Grayson, an older man with a reputation for clinging to the past. Judge Carter, he said, his voice sharp, I get the need for professionalism. But isn't this a bit much? One incident shouldn't rewrite everything. Jessica met his gaze, unflinching. It's not one incident, Alan. It's a pattern. And if we don't act, We're not just failing ourselves, we're failing everyone who looks to us for justice. Power without accountability breeds corruption. We've seen it before, and we'll see it again unless we change. Her words hung heavy, a lesson carved from history and hard-earned truth. Grayson's mouth tightened, but he said nothing more. The room shifted, the weight of her argument settling in. Justice wasn't a gift handed down, it was a garden cultivated through effort, pruned of abuse, and guarded against those who'd let it rot. Jessica knew Blake's stumble, and her stand against it had exposed that truth. The consequences of unchecked power weren't abstract, they were personal, visceral, and all too real. As the meeting ended, she felt the momentum building, a fragile, hopeful thing. Sustaining it would take more than plans or speeches. It would take resolve, hers and theirs, to root out the rot and build something lasting. She was ready to see it through. The air hung heavy between them, thick with the unspoken weight of their confrontation. Jessica Carter stood tall, her posture unyielding, her sharp eyes boring into Officer Ryan Blake as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cracked asphalt of the courthouse parking lot. Her voice sliced through the stillness, crisp and unrelenting. "Authority doesn't automatically earn you respect, Blake," she said, cutting him off mid-sentence. Her tone edged with a fierceness born of years spent clawing her way through disrespect and doubt. "Do you honestly believe I haven't faced my own battles? That I haven't had to fight with everything I've got every single day to carve out the respect I hold now?" Her words weren't just a rebuke, they were a mirror, reflecting her own jagged journey through a world that often refused to see her worth. Blake's jaw tightened, his lips parting as if to argue, but the sound never came. He clamped his mouth shut, his hazel eyes flickering with a mix of defiance and uncertainty. His boots scuffed against the pavement, a restless shuffle that betrayed the storm brewing inside him. Jessica didn't relent. She stepped closer, her voice steady as steel. "This isn't about you feeling like no one's got your back. This is about you taking that frustration and wielding it like a weapon to tear someone else down. Do you even see the difference?" Her question lingered, sharp and pointed, demanding more than a simple answer. It demanded introspection, something Blake clearly wasn't prepared to give. He shifted again, his broad shoulders hunching slightly as his gaze dropped to the ground. The asphalt beneath his feet was weathered and worn, much like the excuses he muttered under his breath. "I didn't mean it like that," he said, his voice low, almost swallowed by the hum of distant traffic. "I wasn't thinking straight. It felt like you were coming at me, challenging me, trying to make me look small in front of everyone." His words stumbled out, raw and unpolished, revealing a man caught between pride and shame. Jessica's expression didn't soften, but her eyes narrowed slightly, pinning him in place. "I wasn't trying to make you look bad, Officer Blake," she said, her tone firm yet laced with an undercurrent of exasperation. "You managed that all by yourself, and instead of facing it, owning up to what you did, you dig your heels in deeper. That's the part that has to stop." Blake's head snapped up, his eyes flashing with a spark of defiance. "It's not that easy, Jessica." He shot back, his voice rising with a frustration that had been simmering too long. "You think I don't want to be better, that I don't want to fix things? This whole system, it's a mess. It's broken, and people like me, we're the ones who get chewed up in it, stuck between the rules and the reality." His hands clenched into fists at his sides, his knuckles whitening as he wrestled with the weight of his own words. He wasn't wrong about the system. Jessica knew that better than most, but she also knew it was no excuse for his actions. Her tone softened, but only just, her words still precise, cutting through his defensiveness like a surgeon's scalpel. "Then stop complaining and start fixing it, Blake. Start with yourself. Look at what you did, at the biases you carry, at how you treat the people around you. Don't let a broken system be your shield for bad behavior, yours or anyone else's." She watched as her words landed, each one a pebble dropped into the still waters of his conscience, rippling outward. Blake's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him, leaving behind a man who looked suddenly smaller, more human. "You make it sound so simple," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper, tinged with a bitterness that spoke of sleepless nights and endless doubts. "It's not." Jessica didn't flinch. "No, it's not simple," she agreed, her gaze unwavering. "But it's necessary." The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. As the two stood locked in a moment neither could easily escape, Blake's face twisted, his frustration giving way to something quieter, something that looked almost like reflection. He nodded, a small, reluctant gesture, as if the weight of her words had finally settled into his bones. "I'll think about it," he said, his voice rough but sincere. Her eyes hardened, unrelenting. "Thinking's not enough, Officer Blake. Show me with your actions, not just empty words." He hesitated, then extended a hand. An olive branch offered with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "I'll try," he said, his tone carrying the faintest promise. "That's all I can give you right now." Jessica didn't take his hand. Instead, she met his gaze squarely, her silence louder than any response. "I don't need promises, Officer Blake," she said, her voice steady and resolute. "I need results." Blake's hand fell slowly to his side, his expression a mix of deflation and determination. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his footsteps heavy but deliberate, echoing faintly against the concrete as he disappeared into the fading light. Jessica watched him go, her chest tight with a blend of resolve and cautious hope. She unlocked her car, the click of the key fob sharp in the stillness, and slid into the driver's seat. As the door thudded shut, she exhaled, letting the tension seep out of her. She knew she'd planted a seed in Blake's mind, a fragile, uncertain thing. Whether it would take root and grow, or wither under the weight of his own resistance, was entirely up to him. By the next morning, the courthouse buzzed with an electric undercurrent, the usual rhythm of footsteps and murmured greetings replaced by hushed whispers and stolen glances. Jessica Carter moved through the marble-lined halls, her heels clicking against the polished floor with a steady, unhurried cadence. The weight of the previous day clung to her like a second skin, but she carried it with the same quiet strength that had brought her this far. Word of her clash with Blake had spread like wildfire, fueled by a grainy cell phone video captured by a passerby. Overnight, it had exploded online, racking up thousands of views, likes, and heated comments that dissected every frame. Blake's aggressive lunge for her phone, her calm defiance in the face of his temper. The footage had turned a private confrontation into a public spectacle, igniting debates that rippled far beyond the courthouse walls. In the break room, a junior clerk named Mia leaned against the counter, her voice low but animated as she spoke to her colleague, Sam. "Did you see that video?" She didn't even flinch, Mia said, her dark eyes wide with admiration. "Not for a second." Sam, stirring sugar into his coffee, nodded grimly. She shouldn't have had to deal with that at all. Blake was way out of line grabbing for her phone like that. "Who does he think he is?" Their words were a quiet chorus of support, a small but growing echo of the sentiment Jessica had stirred. Not everyone agreed. In the courtroom waiting area, to older attorneys, grizzled veterans of the legal world, sat hunched over their briefcases, their voices thick with skepticism. "She could have handled it differently," one said. A man named Harold with silver hair and a perpetual frown. He shook his head, his fingers drumming against the armrest. "Did she really need to record him? That's just pouring gas on the fire." His companion, a weary man named Paul, nodded in agreement. "Exactly. Jessica Carter's a solid judge, no question, but she pushes too hard sometimes. She's going to make enemies if she keeps this up. People don't like being called out like that." Their words carried the weight of tradition, a resistance to the discomfort of change. Meanwhile, near the filing room, a cluster of younger interns gathered, their voices bright with a different energy. "She's a role model, honestly," said Priya, a law student with a sharp mind and sharper ambition. "Most people would have backed down, but she stood her ground." Another intern, a lanky kid named Ethan, nodded eagerly. "It's about time someone shook things up around here. The power imbalance site's been ignored forever. She's making people squirm because they don't want to face what's really going on." Their admiration was palpable, a spark of hope in a place often dulled by routine. Jessica stepped into her chambers, the door creaking softly as it swung shut behind her. Her clerk, a young man named Daniel with a perpetually worried brow, greeted her with a tablet outstretched. "Judge Carter," he said, his voice tentative, "you're going viral." She took the device, her fingers brushing the cool screen as she scrolled through the flood of comments. Beneath the video, The opinions were a chaotic tapestry. Some lauded her as a beacon of courage. Others sneered at her as a troublemaker. "She's an inspiration." Finally, someone standing up to power trips, one read. Another spat venom. "Typical, always making it about gender and race." A third kept it simple. The officer was wrong. She handled it perfectly. And yet another grumbled. Was she making a scene instead of doing her job? Jessica set the tablet down, her face a mask of calm. Though her mind churned with the implications, it was bound to happen, she said, her voice steady, betraying none of the storm within. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "Most of the staff here are behind you," he offered. "But not everyone." Jessica's lips quirked faintly, not quite a smile. "I'm aware," she replied, her tone measured. "And I don't need everyone to like me, Daniel. I need results." Later that day, Captain Morales, a broad-shouldered man with a voice like gravel, called an emergency meeting. The courthouse leadership filed into a cramped conference room, the air thick with tension. Jessica sat near the edge, her presence quiet but commanding, her eyes scanning the faces around her, some supportive, others wary. Morales stood at the front, his hands clasped behind his back. "We all know why we're here," he began, his tone steady but heavy with gravity. "What happened between Judge Carter and Officer Blake has put a spotlight on problems we can't ignore anymore. EBIA's, professionalism, accountability. These aren't just words, they're challenges we have to face head-on." A senior administrator, a weary man named Richard with a pinched expression, raised a hand. "With all due respect, Captain," he said, his voice clipped, "aren't we overreacting? Things like this happen all the time. Was this one special?" Jessica leaned forward, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Because it was caught on camera, Richard. Because the public's watching now, and they won't let us bury it. That's why it's different." Richard's frown deepened, his fingers tapping the table. "So we're only dealing with this because people are loud about it." Jessica didn't blink. "I'm saying this isn't just one moment, it's a sign of bigger cracks. Pretending they don't exist won't fix them. It'll only make them worse." Morales nodded, stepping in to guide the discussion. "Judge Carter's right. This isn't about one incident, it's about building a place where respect and responsibility aren't just ideals, they're the baseline." By the meeting's end, a plan took shape: mandatory training on bias and de-escalation, a clearer process for reporting misconduct, a review of security protocols. It was a start, but Jessica knew the real fight lay ahead. Turning words into action was a steep climb, especially with voices like Richard's dragging their feet. As she left, she caught snippets of conversation from the junior staff members lingering in the hall. "Do you think anything's really going to change?" one asked, her voice tinged with doubt. The other, a young woman with fierce eyes, replied, "It has to. People like Judge Carter won't let it drop." Jessica paused, their words sinking into her like roots into soil. She didn't see herself as a hero or a crusader, just a woman who understood the cost of silence. If she didn't push, who would? Back in her chambers, she stared out the window at the courthouse lawn, the world beyond shifting slowly under the pressure of her actions. Some clung to the old ways, their resistance a heavy anchor. Others embraced the unease, seeing it as the first step toward something better. The path forward stretched long and treacherous, but Jessica was ready. The spark had ignited. Now came the harder task: fanning it into a flame that wouldn't flicker out. Days later, she stood before a packed room of courthouse officials, attorneys, and department heads. The air crackled with anticipation, every eye fixed on her. Captain Morales sat near the front, his jaw tight, a stack of printed proposals laid out before him. Jessica took a deep breath, her voice ringing clear and firm. What happened last week wasn't just a flare-up. It was a window into problems we've let fester too long: issues of justice, of power, of accountability. Today, we start fixing them. She laid out the reforms with precision: training to confront bias, stricter rules for handling complaints, oversight to keep security in check. The room listened, some nodding, others shifting uncomfortably. Halfway through, a hand shot up: Judge Alan Grayson, an older man with a reputation for clinging to the past. "Judge Carter," he said, his voice sharp, "I get the need for professionalism. But isn't this a bit much? One incident shouldn't rewrite everything." Jessica met his gaze. unflinching. "It's not one incident, Alan. It's a pattern. And if we don't act, we're not just failing our Sylvester, we're failing everyone who looks to us for justice. Power without accountability breeds corruption. We've seen it before, and we'll see it again unless we change." Her words hung heavy, a lesson carved from history and hard-earned truth. Grayson's mouth tightened, but he said nothing more. The room shifted, the weight of her argument settling in. Justice wasn't a gift handed down, it was a garden cultivated through effort, pruned of abuse, and guarded against those who'd let it rot. Jessica knew Blake's stumble, and her stand against it had exposed that truth. The consequences of unchecked power weren't abstract, they were personal, visceral, and all too real. As the meeting ended, she felt the momentum building, a fragile, hopeful thing. Sustaining it would take more than plans or speeches. It would take resolve, hers and theirs, to root out the rot and build something lasting. She was ready to see it through. The late afternoon sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban street where Jessica Carter pulled her car to a stop. Outside her modest home, she sat there for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, her mind still buzzing from the day's unrelenting demands. Inside the folder tucked under her arm was a case file she'd read countless times, its words etched into her memory like a mantra. She unfolded it once more, her eyes tracing the lines as the weight of their meaning settled over her like a familiar coat. People didn't transform overnight. Change was a slow, stubborn thing, a battle fought in inches rather than leaps. Yet that flicker of possibility, that fragile hope that they could change, fueled her. It was enough to keep her pushing forward, even when exhaustion gnawed at her bones. With a quiet sigh, she gathered her belongings, a worn leather bag, a thermos still half full of cold coffee, and the stack of files that never seemed to shrink, and stepped out into the evening air. Inside the courthouse earlier that day, Jessica had felt the familiar weight of her purpose pressing against her as she prepared to leave. Her desk had been a chaotic sea of papers, each file a story of struggle, each case a puzzle demanding her attention. She'd cast one last glance at the towering pile awaiting her tomorrow, a relentless tide of work that would crash over her anew with the dawn. The thought didn't daunt her, it steadied her. This was no ordinary job, it was a calling, a fight worth waging. As she moved through the courthouse lobby, her heels clicked against the polished marble floor, echoing faintly in the vast space. Groups of staff lingered near the exits, their chatter softening as she approached. A young clerk paused mid-sentence to offer a respectful nod, his eyes bright with something like awe. An older janitor, leaning on his mop, watched her pass with a quiet, knowing smile, as if he understood the burden she carried. Visitors, too, turned their heads to him with curiosity, others with unspoken admiration. Jessica didn't linger on their reactions, but she couldn't ignore the subtle shift in the air, a ripple of recognition that followed her like a shadow. It wasn't vanity that stirred in her chest, it was a quiet pride, a sense that her presence meant something more than it once had. Stepping outside, she paused on the courthouse steps, the fading light painting the building's towering facade in hues of gold and gray. The structure loomed above her, its stone walls weathered yet unyielding, a monument to the system she'd sworn to serve. It wasn't perfect, she knew that better than anyone. Its cracks ran deep, carved by years of human failure and frailty. But within those imperfections lay potential, a promise she'd dedicated her life to chasing. She unlocked her car and slid into the driver's seat, the leather creaking softly beneath her. As the engine hummed to life, her thoughts drifted to the next day's battle, the endless road to justice stretching out before her, paved with sleepless nights and hard-won victories. It was grueling, soul-wrenching work, but Jessica Carter felt it in her marrow. She was exactly where she was meant to be. That same summer sun blazed mercilessly over a sleepy suburban corner miles away, where 17-year-old Caleb Wright coasted to a stop on his sleek electric scooter. The convenience store's faded sign flickered faintly as he parked, brushing a hand through his neatly cropped hair. Tall and sharp-dressed in a crisp polo and jeans, Caleb carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who knew his worth. His love for numbers and logic had already set him apart. His teachers called him a prodigy, and his father's Fortune 500 company had eagerly snatched him up for a prestigious internship. There his quick mind and infectious charisma had turned heads. earning him a reputation as a standout among the polished suits and corner offices. But today wasn't about boardrooms or balance sheets. It was simpler. Sweet Tara a quick errand to grab his dad's favorite iced tea before they settled in for a father-son. Movie night, a ritual they both cherished. Caleb strode into the store, offering the clerk a weary man with tired eyes a friendly nod. He plucked the tea from the cooler, then added a bag of chips and a candy bar on impulse. The crinkle of the plastic a small rebellion against the day's heat. He paid in cash, pocketed the receipt, and headed back to his scooter, the promise of a lazy evening tugging at his smile. The moment he stepped outside, though, the world tilted. A police cruiser sat parked near the entrance, its engine growling low like a restless beast. A stocky officer, mid-40s with a sunburned neck and sunglasses perched arrogantly on his nose, leaned against the hood. His eyes locked onto Caleb, sharp and predatory, tracking every move as the boy fumbled with his scooter's lock. "Hey, kid," the cop barked, his voice cutting through the thick summer air like a blade. Caleb froze, his heart kicking up a notch, but he turned with practiced calm. "Yes, sir," he replied, polite yet guarded, his tone a shield he'd learned to wield too young. The officer pushed off the car and strode forward, his hand resting casually in the holster at his hip. "What are you doing around here?" he demanded, his words dripping with suspicion. Caleb's brows knit together, confusion flickering in his dark eyes. "Just running an errand." "Is something wrong?" The officer's lip curled into a sneer, his gaze raking over Caleb like he was sizing up a thief caught red-handed. "Funny. You don't look like you belong in this neighborhood. Where'd you get the cash for that stuff? Steal it inside." The accusation hit Caleb like a punch to the gut. His stomach twisted, a sickening mix of anger and resignation swelling inside him. This wasn't new, far from it. He'd felt those same eyes on him before, heard that same tone. The unspoken assumption that his skin marked him as trouble. Each time, it stung anew, a fresh wound layered over old scars. But he steadied himself, drawing a slow breath. "Sir, I paid for these," he said evenly, holding up the crumpled receipt, its ink still sharp from the printer. The officer barely glanced at it, his expression hardening. "I think you should come with me. Let's see if the clerk backs that up." Caleb didn't budge, his feet planted firm against the cracked pavement. Fear wasn't the issue. He wasn't afraid of this man, but he knew one wrong move could turn this into something uglier. Behind the officer, a small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the tension like moths to a flame. Their whispers buzzed in the stifling heat, a chorus of curiosity and unease. Then a voice sliced through the murmur, a deep, commanding baritone that made every head swivel. "Excuse me, officer." The cop stiffened mid-step, his swagger faltering as he turned. Caleb's gaze followed, and a slow, relieved grin broke across his face. There stood Charles Wright, his father, in a crisp white shirt and slacks, the picture of understated power. His phone was in hand, its camera rolling, capturing every second of the scene unfolding in the parking lot. Charles's presence was electric, a quiet storm rolling in. He wasn't just Caleb's dad who was his boss, a titan in the corporate world whose name carried weight the officer couldn't yet fathom. "Care to explain what's going on here?" Charles asked, his voice smooth as polished steel, cold as the iced tea in Caleb's bag. The officer squared his shoulders, caught off guard, but unwilling to yield. "Stay out of this," he snapped, waving a dismissive hand. "I'm handling a situation here." Charles's eyebrow arched, his calm unshaken. "A predator sizing up prey too foolish to run." "A situation? You mean my son buying snacks from a store? I'd love to hear how that's a crime." The officer scowled, doubling down. "Look, this kid was acting suspicious. I saw him loitering outside, wanted to make sure nothing illegal was going on. It's called doing my job." Caleb opened his mouth to protest, but Charles silenced him with a subtle gesture, a silent promise that he'd handle this. The crowd swelled, their murmurs growing sharper, their eyes darting between father and son and the officer caught in their crosshairs. "Acting suspicious, you say?" Charles's tone was measured, but a razor's edge glinted beneath it. What exactly was suspicious? The way he paid for his items? Or maybe the way he answered your questions with more respect than you deserve? The officer shifted, his bravado flickering like a candle in the wind. For a moment, doubt flashed in his eyes, but he puffed out his chest, clinging to his authority. I don't have to explain myself to you. Charles's gaze narrowed, a quiet fury simmering beneath his composure. Oh, but you will. Because I've been recording this whole encounter, and I have to say, officer, you're not painting yourself in a flattering light. He held up his phone, the lens catching the sunlight, a silent witness to the injustice unfolding. The crowd's whispers grew louder, their faces a mix of outrage and anticipation. The officer glanced around, sensing the tide turning against him. Let's not make a scene, he muttered, his confidence wilting. A scene, Charles echoed, his voice now tinged with incredulity. You made the scene when you decided to harass a young man for daring to exist in your presence. But please, go. Need love to hear how do you justify this. The officer's eyes darted to Caleb, desperation creeping in as he grasped for control. All right, let's see some ID, he barked, loud enough for the crowd to hear. If you've got nothing to hide, you won't mind proving who you are. Caleb exchanged a glance with his father, reading the subtle nod that said to play along for now. Carefully, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and handed over his driver's license. The officer snatched it, scrutinizing it with exaggerated care, as if hoping to unearth some hidden crime. Then his face froze. Wait a second, he mumbled, reading aloud. Caleb Wright is in Charles Wright. He looked up, meeting Charles's faint, knowing smile. The realization hit like a thunderclap, and the cop's cheeks flushed a faint red. Though he masked it with a grunt. Doesn't matter who your dad is, he said, shoving the license back. Just following protocol. Charles stepped closer, his towering frame now level with the officer's, his voice low and unyielding. You're not following protocol. You're abusing your power, and now you're scrambling to save face with the world watching. Shall I keep recording, or are you ready to admit you've crossed a line? The crowd, emboldened by Charles's unwavering stance, pressed closer, their voices rising in a sharp, accusatory hum. The officer shifted, sweat beading on his brow as the weight of his actions crashed down. He'd underestimated the boy, misjudged the father, and now stood exposed under the unrelenting gaze of justice. Charles wasn't done it by a long shot. His quiet authority wasn't just a shield for his son, it was a mirror, reflecting the consequences of unchecked power back at the man who'd wielded it so carelessly. For Jessica, for Caleb, for Charles. The lesson was clear. Justice wasn't a gift bestowed from above. It was a fire kindled by those brave enough to stand against the storm. A flame that burned brighter with every voice that joined the fight. The officer's fingers twitched with a restless irritation that pulsed through his veins, the faint tremor betraying the storm brewing beneath his carefully constructed facade. Around him, the hum of the swelling crowd grew louder, a buzzing chorus of whispers and half-spoken judgments that gnawed at his nerves. His sharp gaze darted restless life first to Charles, whose steady, unflinching expression seemed carved from stone, then to Caleb, whose quiet defiance radiated a strength far beyond his years, and finally to the sea of onlookers, their cell phones raised like a forest of accusing eyes capturing his every faltering move. You don't intimidate me, he declared, his voice ringing out with a firmness he desperately clung to, though it lacked the unshakable confidence that had bolstered him just moments ago. He crossed his arms tightly over his chest, as if the gesture could shield him from the uncomfortable reality, pressing in from all Sedessa flimsy armor against the truth he refused to face. Charles tilted his head slightly, his response slicing through the tension like a blade honed to perfection. Rules are rules, he echoed, his tone cool and piercing, each word dripping with a deliberate precision that left no room for retreat. Please, enlighten us all. Tell me, what rule justifies profiling a young man simply because of the color of his skin? What regulation grants you the authority to accuse him of theft without a shred of evidence? To back it up, go ahead, officer, educate us. His voice carried a quiet challenge, daring the man to justify the unjustifiable, and the weight of it hung heavy in the air. The officer's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching faintly as he wrestled with the accusation. I didn't accuse him of anything, he shot back, his words clipped and defensive. Though a faint tremor undermined his bravado, I asked questions. That's my right as an officer of the law. But Charles wasn't about to let him off so easily. Raising a single eyebrow, he pulled out his phone with a deliberate slowness. His movements calm, yet laced with intent. "You didn't accuse him," he repeated, his voice laced with a skepticism that cut deeper than any shout. "Let's rewind the tape, shall we? Where'd you get the cash for that stuff? Did you steal it?" "Those were your exact words, officer, or did I imagine that little exchange?" The crowd murmured in unison, a ripple of agreement spreading through them. Some nodded solemnly, their faces etched with quiet outrage, while others shook their heads in weary dismay, their faith in the uniform before them eroding with every passing second. The officer shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his boots scuffing against the pavement as he grew painfully aware of the cameras trained on him. Every lens felt like a spotlight, exposing the cracks in his authority. "Look, I'm just doing my job," he insisted, his voice rising with a defensiveness that bordered on desperation. "We've had reports of thefts in this area." He matched the description. Charles folded his arms, his expression an unreadable mask that somehow conveyed both patience and disdain. "Thefts, you say? And what's this description? A young black man on a scooter? That's awfully specific, isn't it?" His words were measured, but the sarcasm threading through them was sharp enough to draw blood. The officer's lips pressed into a thin, stubborn line, his silence screaming louder than any excuse. "I'm not at liberty to share that information," he muttered, the deflection weak and hollow. "Convenient," Charles replied, his tone dry as desert sand. He turned to his son, his gaze softening for a fleeting moment. "Caleb, have you heard anything about thefts around here lately?" Caleb, standing tall despite the weight of the moment, shook his head with a quiet resolve. "No, sir. I've been coming to the same store all summer, same scooter, same routine. Never had a problem until today." His voice was steady, carrying a dignity that belied his youth, and the simplicity of his truth landed like a hammer on glass. The officer opened his mouth to argue, but Charles raised a hand, cutting him off with the authority of a man who knew the power of his presence. "I think we both know there haven't been any thefts," he said, his voice low and deliberate, each word a stone laid in a wall of undeniable logic. "What we do have here is a glaring abuse of power, an officer who's stumbled into a mess of his own making and can't find a way out." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, their voices tinged with a simmering anger and disbelief that crackled like static in the air. From the back, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a worn jacket pushed forward, her voice cutting through the noise. "Leave the kid alone. He didn't do anything," she shouted, her words raw with frustration, a mother's instinct bleeding through her tone as if Caleb were her own. The officer's cheeks flushed a deep crimson, the color rising like a tide as his bravado crumbled under the weight of scrutiny. He opened his mouth again, grasping for something to salvage his dignity. But Charles stepped closer, his presence towering, without ever raising his voice. "You should know," he began, his tone dropping to a quieter, more piercing register. "Caleb isn't just some kid you can harass and walk away from. He's my son, and I'm not just his father. Charles Wright, CEO of Wright Enterprises. You've probably heard of us. We partner with several major organizations, including Let's See City's police department." He paused, letting the revelation settle like dust after an explosion. "In fact, I believe your precinct just signed a rather lucrative tech contract with my company not too long ago." The officer's eyes widened, a flicker of panic darting across his face as his body stiffened. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable as defiance melting into a knees as the ground beneath him seemed to tilt. "That's right," Charles continued, his calm unbroken, his words a slow, deliberate march toward checkmate. "I'm your boss's boss, officer. And right now, you're teetering on the edge of a mistake that could cost you more than you can possibly imagine." The crowd fell into a hushed awe, their whispers fading into a collective breath held in anticipation. The officer stared at Charles, then flicked his gaze to Caleb, who now stood a little straighter, his father's unwavering support lending him a quiet strength that radiated outward. The realization hit the officer like a runaway train, crashing through his stubborn resolve. But he wasn't ready to surrender just yet. I don't care who you are, he muttered, though the fire in his voice had dimmed to a flicker. Everyone's subject to the law. Charles tilted his head, his calm demeanor unshaken, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. And who enforces that law? Men like you, who think a badge gives them the right to intimidate, profile, and humiliate. Let's be clear, this isn't about the law. It's about your assumptions, and those assumptions just blew up in your face. The crowd was no longer murmuring quietly. Their voices rose, some filming every word with steady hands, others shaking their heads in disbelief. A weary man in a faded baseball cap whispered to his friend, "He doesn't know when to quit," while a young woman nearby muttered under her breath, "This is going viral for sure." The officer's shoulders stiffened, but his face betrayed a growing panic, his eyes darting between the faces closing in around him. "Look," he said, his voice tight with strain, "I didn't mean anything by it. I was just being cautious." "Cautious," Charles repeated, his eyebrow arching with a skepticism that felt like a spotlight on the officer's flimsy excuse. "By accusing an innocent teenager of theft, by reaching for your gun, when he dared to answer your questions. That's your definition of cautious." The officer's hand twitched away from his holster, a reflex he couldn't hide, and the crowd noticed. A few gasps rippled through the group, sharp and accusatory, as Charles's gaze locked onto his, steady and unrelenting. "Let's review what's happened here," Charles said, stepping closer, his voice a calm storm building momentum. "You approached my son with no evidence of wrongdoing. You accused him of stealing because he looked suspicious, and now when confronted, you're squirming instead of owning up to your mistake. Does that sound like law enforcement to you, officer? Or does it sound like harassment dressed up in a uniform?" The officer's jaw clenched so hard it seemed his teeth might crack, but he stayed silent, trapped in the web of his own actions. "I'll make this simple," Charles said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who knew he held all the cards. "You've got two options right now. One, you admit your mistake, apologize to my son, and walk away. Two, we take this further. I'll send this footage to my legal team, the city council, and the local media. Oh, and I'll personally request a full review of your conduct by your superiors. Trust Matthew, listen." The officer's face twisted with a mix of anger, humiliation, and dread, his eyes flicking to Caleb, who watched his father with a quiet pride that glowed like a beacon. Then he glanced at the crowd, now larger and more expectant, their gazes burning into him like 1,000 tiny fires. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until the officer finally exhaled, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Fine," he muttered, the word barely audible. "I'll apologize." The crowd stirred, a wave of surprise and approval washing over them. But Charles held up a hand, his expression unwavering. "Not so fast," he said, his voice firm yet measured. "An apology's just the start. There's more you'll need to do, officer, and believe me, you won't want to miss what's coming next." The officer's jaw tightened again, his eyes darting nervously between Charles and the sea of faces, their phones still rolling. He was cornered, and he knew with his pride battered, his authority stripped away piece by piece. Charles gestured to Caleb, who stood quietly, his steady gaze meeting his father's with a trust that spoke volumes. "You owe him an apology," Charles said, his tone unyielding but fair. "But that's not where this ends." The officer squirmed, his reluctance palpable, but the weight of the moment left him no escape. "All right," he muttered, his voice low and grudging. Clearing his throat, he turned to Caleb, his words stiff and forced. "I'm sorry for accusing you of stealing and treating you unfairly. That was wrong." Caleb gave a slight nod, his expression calm but unyielding, waiting for his father's next move. In that moment, the lesson hung heavy in the air. Justice wasn't just about rules or power. It was about accountability, about facing the consequences of wielding authority without care. The officer had learned it the hard way, his misstep a glaring reminder that abusing power didn't just harm the innocent, it unraveled the very foundation of trust he stood upon. And as the crowd watched, their voices rising in a chorus of reckoning, it was clear that this was a story they'd carry forward, a testament to the cost of arrogance and the quiet strength of those who refused to bow. The officer raised his hand once more, his voice faltering as he tried to dismiss the moment with a weak, "That's not good enough." But the words hung heavy in the air, unmet by the sincerity they demanded. Charles stood firm, his gaze piercing through the officer's fragile defenses. "Your apology needs depth." Charles pressed, his tone steady but unyielding. "It's not enough to just say sorry. You have to show you understand what you've done. Admit that your actions stemmed from prejudice. Say it out loud." The officer's face flushed a deep crimson, the heat of shame and frustration rising to his cheeks. His discomfort was palpable, a storm brewing beneath his skin as he struggled to find the right words. He began, then stopped, his jaw tightening as he wrestled with the admission. Finally, he forced it out, his voice low and strained. "I may have judged based on how things looked, and that was wrong of me." The crowd surrounding them shifted restlessly, their reactions a kaleidoscope of emotions. Some nodded with quiet satisfaction. Others narrowed their eyes in skepticism. Unconvinced by the officer's reluctant confession, Charles studied the man for a long, deliberate moment, his expression unreadable but his presence commanding. The officer squirmed under that scrutiny, his uniform suddenly feeling too tight, too hot. "Better," Charles said at last, his voice carrying a faint note of approval, though it was tempered with expectation. "But I told you there's more you need to do." The officer's eyes flickered with unease, a shadow of dread crossing his face. "What now?" His expression seemed to scream, though he didn't dare voice it. Charles reached into his wallet with a slow, deliberate motion, pulling out a crisp business card. He extended it toward the officer, who hesitated before taking it, his fingers brushing the edge as if it might burn him. "This," Charles said, his voice firm but calm, "is the contact for a community anti-bias training program. You're going to sign up for it. You're going to attend every session. And then you're going to write me a detailed report about what you've learned and everything you've taken away from it. I expect that report on my desk in 2 weeks." The officer's mouth dropped open, a mix of disbelief and indignation flashing across his features. "What?" he sputtered, his voice rising. "That's not." Charles cut him off, his tone sharp and unyielding, slicing through the officer's protest like a blade. "You're a public servant," he said, each word deliberate, heavy with meaning. "Your duty is to protect and serve every person in this community, not to harass or intimidate them based on snap judgments. If you're not willing to put in the effort to treat all citizens with fairness and respect, then you have no right to wear that badge." He leaned in slightly, his eyes locking with the officer's, a silent challenge burning in them. "And let me be clear, if you refuse, I've got this entire encounter on video. I'll take it to every news outlet, every social media platform, every authority I can reach. Don't test me." The crowd erupted in a wave of murmurs, their approval rippling through the air. A few clapped, their hands striking together with sharp, defiant sounds, while others whispered to each other, their faces alight with a mix of awe and vindication. The officer stared down at the card in his hand, his knuckles whitening as he gripped it. Anger simmered in his eyes, but it was overshadowed by a creeping sense of defeat. He didn't argue further. With a curt nod, he muttered, "Fine," the word grinding out through clenched teeth. He slipped the card into his pocket, the motion stiff and mechanical, as if he were forcing himself through every second of it. "Good," Charles replied, his tone final, a door slamming shut on the conversation. "Now, I suggest you leave. Your work here is finished." The officer cast one last glance at Caleb, who stood quietly nearby, his young face composed but his eyes sharp with understanding. Then the officer's gaze swept over the crowd, taking in their expectant stares, before he turned on his heel and strode toward his squad car. His boots struck the pavement with a rhythm of frustration, and when he reached the vehicle, he yanked the door open with unnecessary force. The slam of it echoed down the street, a punctuation mark to his exit. Moments later, the cruiser peeled away, its tires humming against the asphalt, the siren conspicuously silent, a retreat without fanfare. The crowd burst into cheers, their voices rising in a triumphant swell. Some shouted words of encouragement to Charles and Caleb, their tones warm with gratitude and admiration. But Charles didn't linger to soak in the praise. He turned to his son, placing a steady hand on Caleb's shoulder, the weight of it grounding them both. "You okay, son?" he asked, his voice softening, laced with a father's quiet concern. Caleb looked up at him, a small smile breaking through the calm mask he'd worn throughout the ordeal. "Yeah, Dad," he said, his voice steady but tinged with relief. "I'm okay. Thanks to you." As the officer's cruiser vanished around a corner, the crowd began to thin, people drifting away in twos and threes, their chatter still buzzing with the energy of what they'd witnessed. A few lingered, though, their eyes bright with excitement, phones still clutched in their hands as they recorded the aftermath. Charles gave Caleb's shoulder a reassuring squeeze, then turned to face the remaining onlookers. "I appreciate your support," he said, his voice rising above the hum of conversation, clear and resonant. "But this isn't just about my son or what happened here today. It's about accountability. It's about fairness. It's about making sure that those who hold power, those who wear badges and wield authority, are held to the same standards as the rest of us." The crowd nodded, some raising their phones higher to capture his words, others simply listening with rapt attention. "Too often," Charles continued, his voice growing stronger, more impassioned, "we see moments like this unfold, and nothing changes. The injustice festers, and the consequences fade away. But today, we stood up. We faced it head-on, with calm and with purpose, and we showed that it can make a difference." He glanced down at Caleb, who met his father's gaze with a look of quiet pride. Then back at the group. "If you ever find yourself in a situation like this, remember this: your dignity, your voice, they are powerful. Use them wisely." Applause broke out again, louder this time, a chorus of agreement and appreciation. Charles offered a polite nod, acknowledging their response, then turned back to Caleb. "You ready to head home?" he asked, his tone shifting back to the gentle cadence of a father. Caleb hesitated, his eyes drifting over the lingering crowd, some still filming, their lenses glinting in the late afternoon sun. "Dad," he said quietly, his voice thoughtful, "I feel like this isn't over." Charles smiled, a knowing glint in his eyes. "Oh, it's not," he replied, his words carrying a weight of promise. "We've made a ripple here, but the real work starts when the cameras turn off." Before they could leave, a young woman stepped forward from the dwindling crowd, her stride purposeful. She clutched a notepad in one hand, a pen poised in the other, and her expression was one of eager determination. "Mr. Wright," she said, her voice bright but professional, "I'm with the City Times. Would you mind if I asked you a few questions about what just happened? I think people need to hear this story." Charles glanced at Caleb, who gave a small nod of encouragement, then turned back to the journalist. "I'll answer your questions," he said, his tone measured but firm. "But let's get one thing straight: this isn't just about one officer's mistake. This is about a system that's broken, one that needs real reform. Let's talk about solutions, not just point fingers." The journalist nodded eagerly, her pen already scratching across the page as Charles began to speak. Caleb stood nearby, watching his father navigate the moment with a grace and purpose that filled him with awe. Pride swelled in his chest, not just for how his dad had stood up for him, but for how he'd taken a raw, ugly moment and spun it into something meaningful, something that could spark change. As the interview wound down, Charles handed the journalist his business card, his fingers steady as he passed it over. "Feel free to reach out if you need more," he said, his voice warm but professional. With that, father and son finally made their way to the car. Caleb carried his bag of snacks, the earlier tension in his shoulders replaced by a quiet ease, though his mind still buzzed with the day's events. The drive home was quiet at first, the hum of the engine filling the space between them. Charles's hands gripped the steering wheel, his brow furrowed in thought, while Caleb stared out the window, watching the world blur by. Finally, Caleb broke the silence. "Dad," he asked, his voice calm but laced with curiosity. Charles glanced at him, his expression softening. "Yes, son." Caleb turned to face him fully. "What's next?" Charles's lips curved into a faint smile, though his eyes remained fixed on the road ahead. "What's next?" he said, his voice steady and resolute, "is making sure this doesn't end here. That officer and others like him can keep acting this way without facing real consequences. We've got the footage, we've got witnesses, And now, we've got a platform. We're going to make it count." Caleb nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "You always have a plan, don't you?" Charles chuckled, the sound low and warm, a rare break in his serious demeanor. "Always," he said. "And you're part of it. I'll lay it all out when we get home." What Charles revealed later wasn't just a plan, it was a vision. A bold move that would shake their community to its core. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, casting long shadows across the table where Charles sat. His laptop glowed in front of him, its screen filled with emails and drafts, while his phone buzzed incessantly beside it, a symphony of notifications. News of the confrontation had spread like wildfire overnight. Local outlets had picked up the story, and clips of Charles facing down the officer had ricocheted across the internet, shared thousands of times. The hashtag #StandWithCaleb was trending, a digital rallying cry. Caleb shuffled into the room, still in his pajamas, his hair tousled from sleep. He poured himself a bowl of cereal, the clink of the spoon against porcelain cutting through the quiet. "Dad," he said, scrolling through his phone as he leaned against the counter, "you've got the whole internet talking about us." Charles looked up, a faint smile tugging at his lips, though his focus remained sharp. "It's not about us, Caleb," he said, his voice steady. "It's about making sure this kind of thing doesn't happen again to anyone." He tapped a few keys on his laptop, then spun it around to face his son. "Take a look at this." Caleb stepped closer, peering at the screen. It was a draft email, addressed to the mayor, the police commissioner, and every member of the city council. He read aloud, his voice soft but growing stronger with each word. "The recent incident involving Officer Daniels underscores the urgent need for systemic reform in our city's law enforcement practices. As a community leader and a father, I'm calling for mandatory anti-bias training, independent oversight for complaints, and transparent accountability measures." "Wow," Caleb said, his eyes wide with admiration. "Do you think they'll listen?" Charles leaned back in his chair, his expression unwavering. "They'll have to," he replied, "especially once the media turns up the heat. But we're not stopping there." Caleb tilted his head, curiosity sparking in his gaze. "What else are we doing?" Charles folded his arms, a glint of determination in his eyes. "This isn't just about changing policies, it's about changing people. I'm organizing a town hall meeting. We're bringing together community leaders, activists, even law enforcement. We're going to talk solutions, and we're going to hold them accountable." Caleb let out a low whistle, his tone thoughtful. "That's a lot," he said, "but it's good, really good." As the morning wore on, Charles's phone continued to buzz, a relentless stream of calls and messages. Leaders from civil rights groups, local business owners, even a handful of officers reached out, offering support, pledging resources. By midday, Charles had turned their home office into a command center. A civil rights attorney with a sharp mind and a quick laugh sat at one end of the table, scribbling notes. A community organizer, her voice warm but fierce, brainstormed outreach ideas. A tech-savvy friend, his fingers flying across a laptop, volunteered to run the social media campaign, his enthusiasm infectious. Caleb lingered in the doorway, watching his father take charge. Charles stood at the head of the table, his presence steady and commanding. "Here's the plan," he said, his voice cutting through the chatter. "We're hosting the town hall in 1 week. Until then, we keep the momentum alive." The room buzzed with energy, each person adding their voice, their ideas, their passion. Caleb felt a swell of pride not just for his father's resolve, but for the lesson woven into every moment. Justice wasn't a gift handed down. It was a fight, a consequence of power misused, and a legacy worth building. The late afternoon sun cast long, golden streaks through the cluttered meeting room where Charles Wright sat, his brow furrowed in deep thought. Around him, a small group of determined activists murmured amongst themselves, their voices a quiet hum of resolve. Papers littered the tablet petitions, hastily scribbled notes, and flyers urging reform. Charles, a man whose steady presence commanded respect, leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the wood. He had just finished outlining a plan to circulate a petition online, rallying support through hashtags and inviting anyone willing to join their cause. The energy in the room buzzed with purpose, each person acutely aware that this fight wasn't just about one moment, it was about dismantling a deeply rooted system. An attorney in the group, a weary woman with sharp eyes and a notepad clutched tightly in her hands, raised a slender hand to interrupt the flow of conversation. Her voice cut through the air, measured but insistent. "Charles, have you given any thought to filing an official complaint against Officer Daniels? Something formal, something that could ripple outward and set a legal precedent." She leaned forward slightly, her gaze piercing, as if she could already see the courtroom in her mind. Charles nodded slowly, his dark eyes glinting with a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "It's already in the works," he replied, his tone steady but carrying an undercurrent of urgency. "But this isn't just about Daniels. He's a symptom, not the disease. We need to uproot the culture itself, systemic change, not a slap on the wrist for one man." His words hung heavy in the air, and the group responded with murmurs of agreement, their faces etched with a shared resolve that felt almost tangible. They weren't just nodding to appease him. They felt it in their bones. This was a battle worth waging. As the meeting drew to a close, the clatter of chairs scraping against the hardwood floor filled the space. People gathered their belongings, their conversations shifting to logistics and next steps. Amid the shuffle, a young voice broke through the noise, earnest, tentative, yet brimming with a quiet strength. Caleb, Charles's teenage son, approached his father, his sneakers scuffing softly against the floor. "Dad, can I help with anything?" he asked, his wide eyes searching his father's face for a purpose, a way to contribute. There was a raw sincerity in his tone, a longing to be part of something bigger than himself. Charles turned to his son, a faint smile softening the hard lines of his face. He rested a heavy hand on Caleb's shoulder, the weight of it conveying both pride and reassurance. "You've already done more than you realize, Caleb," he said, his voice low and warm. "Just keep being yourself, that's enough. It's the best way to show people what we're fighting for." His words were a bomb, but beneath them lay an unspoken trust. He saw in Caleb the same fire that burned in him, tempered by a youthfulness he envied. Caleb nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line, but the flicker of restlessness in his eyes betrayed him. He wasn't content to sit idly by, to let his father and the others carry the torch alone. That night, as Charles stayed late with his team, poring over strategies under the dim glow of a flickering lamp, Caleb retreated to his room. The house was quiet, save for the distant hum of the city outside his window, a city that felt both familiar and hostile. After what had happened, he sank onto his bed, the springs creaking under his weight, and pulled out his phone. The screen lit up his face in a cold blue glow as he scrolled through an endless cascade of posts about the incident. This incident, the video of Officer Daniels stopping him, a kid on a scooter, outside a store where he didn't belong, had spread like wildfire. Comments ranged from outrage to cruel indifference, and each one stoked a fire in Caleb's chest. His father had always preached the value of calm, calculated move, a strategy over impulse. But sitting there, the weight of the world pressing down on his narrow shoulders, Caleb felt a different pull. He wanted to reach people, not just as a symbol, but as a person. After a long moment of staring into the void of his screen, he made up his mind. He grabbed his phone, propped it against a stack of books on his nightstand, and hit record. "Hey, everyone," he began, his voice steady but trembling with a raw emotion he couldn't suppress. "My name's Caleb Wright. You've probably seen the video by now, the one where I'm the kid on the scooter. The one that officer thought didn't fit in that store." He paused, his throat tightening as he relived the humiliation. The way Danielle's voice had dripped with suspicion, the way his hands had hovered near his badge like a threat. "I've been thinking a lot about it," he continued, his gaze drifting off camera for a heartbeat before locking back onto the lens. "And it's not just about me. It's about how many people, kids, adults, anyone, go through this every single day. They're judged for their clothes, their neighborhood, their skin. It's wrong. It's suffocating. And it's got to stop." He shifted closer to the camera, his voice gaining strength, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his hoodie. "But I don't want to just complain. I want to help fix it. That's why I'm working with my dad to put together a town hall next week. If you've ever felt this, Or if you just want things to be better, please come. Your story matters. Your voice matters." He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling visibly. "We can't undo yesterday, but we can build tomorrow. Let's do it together." With a final nod, firm yet laced with hope, he stopped the recording. Caleb watched the playback once, his heart pounding in his ears, then uploaded it to every platform he could think of: Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. Satisfied, or at least too tired to second-guess himself, he crawled under the covers and drifted into an uneasy sleep, the phone still clutched in his hand. He had no idea what he'd unleashed. By morning, his world had exploded. The phone buzzed incessantly on his nightstand, jolting him awake, bleary-eyed. He squinted at the screen notifications piled up like a digital avalanche. His video had gone viral overnight, racking up millions of views. Comments flooded in, a tidal wave of voices. Some shared their own tales of profiling and prejudice, their words raw and jagged with pain. Others praised his poise, his courage, calling him a leader despite his age. Caleb sat up, his breath catching in his throat as he scrolled, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of it all. Downstairs, Charles was nursing a cup of coffee when Caleb shuffled into the kitchen, phone in hand. "Dad, you've got to see this," he said, his voice a mix of awe and nerves. He played the video for his father, watching Charles's face shift from curiosity to stunned silence. "You did this, all by yourself?" Charles asked. His eyes locked on the screen as Caleb's words echoed through the small speaker. Caleb nodded, ducking his head slightly, a shy pride tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I just thought people should hear it from me, not just you. I wanted them to know why it matters." Charles set the phone down gently, a slow, radiant smile breaking across his face. "Caleb, you've always had this wisdom I can't even explain. This is powerful, more than you know." His voice cracked with emotion, a rare vulnerability from a man who carried so much on his shoulders. The ripple effect of Caleb's video stretched far beyond their cramped kitchen. News stations latched onto the story, beaming his message into living rooms across the country. The town hall he'd mentioned became a headline event, with local leaders, activists, and even a few celebrities reaching out to lend their support. Their phones rang non-stop offers to amplify the cause, requests for interviews, messages of solidarity. But the most surprising turn came later that day, when an email pinged into Charles's inbox from the police department itself. It wasn't just a perfunctory apology, it was an olive branch, signed by Police Commissioner James Rutherford. It read, "We've seen Caleb's video and the response it sparked. We'd like to meet with you both to discuss concrete steps toward improving community relations. Your voices are vital to this dialogue." Charles read it aloud, his voice steady but tinged with disbelief. He looked at Caleb, who sat across from him at the kitchen table, his cereal forgotten. "This is big, Caleb," Charles said, folding his arms. "But it's only the start." Caleb met his father's gaze, his jaw set with a determination that mirrored Charles's own. "I'm ready, Dad," he replied, his voice quiet but unshakable. Neither of them could have foreseen the twist awaiting them at that Meetinga moment that would test their resolve in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The following week, Charles and Caleb stepped into the police department's stark, gray building, the air thick with tension. Two officers flanked them as they crossed the lobby, their boots echoing against the polished tile. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, amplifying the weight of the moment. Caleb's stomach churned, but he kept his chin up, his eyes darting to the framed portraits of past commissioners lining the wall-strewn faces staring down in judgment. Charles walked beside him, his posture calm but alert, a pillar of strength Caleb leaned on without realizing it. They were ushered into a conference room where Commissioner James Rutherford waited, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with graying hair and a face etched with years of hard decisions. He extended a hand, his grip firm but his expression guarded, as if he were sizing them up. "Mr. Wright, Caleb," he began, his voice deep and resonant, filling the room. "Thank you for coming. What you've both done is starting this conversation at something we can't ignore." He gestured to the chairs across from him, and Charles sat, his movements deliberate, while Caleb hesitated before taking his seat, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Rutherford leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "We've watched Caleb's video," he said, his eyes flicking to the boy, "and we've heard the calls for reform. This isn't a moment we can brush aside. But the real question is, where do we go from here?" His tone was earnest, but there was a challenge woven into it, a test of their intentions. Charles glanced at Caleb, then back at Rutherford, his voice calm but edged with steel. "The next step isn't just words, Commissioner, it's action. Your department needs to publicly admit there's work to be done, real work. People need to see you're listening, that you're serious about change." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "This isn't about platitudes, it's about accountability." Caleb, who had been silent, absorbing every word, finally spoke. His voice was soft, but carried a quiet force that made the room still. "You've got to hold your officers accountable the time, not just when someone's recording. It's not enough to punish one guy. You've got to change how things work here." His eyes locked onto Rutherford's, unflinching despite the knot of nerves in his gut. The commissioner nodded slowly, his fingers drumming lightly against the table as he processed Caleb's words. "You're right," he said after a beat. "That's why we're starting with ourselves. We've already kicked off a review of our protocol. Smandry anti-bias training starts next month, across every division. But I want to push further." He hesitated, his jaw tightening as if wrestling with the decision. "We're bringing in outside groups to audit our practices, top to bottom, and we're making it public every step, every finding." Caleb's brow creased, his mind racing. "That's a start," he said, his tone cautious. "But what about the officer who stopped me, Daniels? He's still out there. What's happening with him?" The question hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. The room grew quiet, the tension coiling tighter. Rutherford shifted in his seat, discomfort flickering across his face. "He's under investigation," he said carefully, "but I can't promise an outcome yet. Due process takes time." Charles leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "We get due process, Commissioner, but you've seen what happens when bias festers unchecked. It's not just about Daniels, it's the environment that lets him think he can act that way. That's what we're here to fix." His words were a quiet thunder, resonating with years of frustration and hope. Rutherford exhaled, a long, heavy breath that seemed to carry the weight of his position. "You're not wrong, Mr. Wright. We've been too complacent. But I'm telling you now, we're in this. We're committed." He looked between them, his gaze softening. "Next week, we're holding a meeting to roll out these changes publicly. We want the community involved. And I'd like you both on our advisory board for reform." Caleb blinked, caught off guard by the offer. He glanced at his father, then back at Rutherford. "I'll think about it," he said, his voice steady but thoughtful. "But I'm not here just for me. I'm here for everyone who's been silenced." Charles squeezed his son's shoulder, pride radiating from him like heat from a flame. "We'll be watching, Commissioner," he said. "But if you're ready to do the work, so are we." As they left the room, the air felt lighter, but the road ahead loomed large and uncertain. Caleb's heart thudded with a mix of hope and resolve and knew this was only the beginning, a fragile first step toward justice. And in that moment, he understood the lesson his father had lived by. Power, when abused, crumbled under the weight of its own consequences. But when wielded with purpose, it could build something enduring. Together, they'd make sure of it. The air hung heavy with unspoken words as Caleb's eyes met his father Charles's, a silent pact shimmering between them beneath the dim streetlights. They both understood this battle was far from its entate's triumph, was merely a spark, a bold declaration that rippled through their small town like a stone tossed into still water. They had dared to shove back against the suffocating weight of injustice, igniting a conversation that might one day reshape their entire community. Yet, as the adrenaline ebbed from their veins, a quiet unease settled in. The road ahead loomed long and treacherous, its shadows concealing trials neither could yet foresee. A week later, the town hall stood transformed, its weathered wooden beams and flickering fluorescent lights bearing witness to a swelling tide of determination. Charles and Caleb had poured every ounce of their energy into this moment, rallying neighbors, friends, and even strangers to fill the creaking seats. The room buzzed with life. Farmers in worn overalls sat shoulder to shoulder with shopkeepers, Young mothers cradled restless babies, and a cluster of local leaders whispered among themselves near the front. Even a handful of police officers from the department lingered along the walls, their stiff postures betraying a mix of curiosity and discomfort. The air crackled with expectation, thick with the scent of old coffee and the faint rustle of papers clutched in nervous hands. Hope flickered here, fragile but fierce, as people leaned forward, eyes locked on the two men who had become their unlikely champions. As Charles and Caleb settled into their seats at the front, a hush swept through the crowd, the atmosphere shifting like the calm before a storm. This wasn't just another dreary meeting destined to dissolve into forgotten promises. This was a crucible, a moment that could forge something enduring. The police commissioner, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair and a jaw set like stone, strode to the podium, flanked by senior officers whose polished badges glinted under the lights. He cleared his throat and began, his voice steady as he outlined the department's latest proposals: revamped training programs to curb excessive force, an independent oversight board to sniff out corruption, and a pledge to let sunlight pierce the murky veil of secrecy that had long shrouded their ranks. The words were predictable, polished, and rehearsed, but Charles sensed something different today. The room pulsed with a restless energy, a blend of doubt and fragile faith. People weren't just nodding along anymore, they were watching, waiting, ready to pounce if the promises rang hollow. Then it was Caleb's turn. He rose slowly, his palms slick with sweat, his heart hammering so fiercely he feared it might burst through his ribs. He'd already bared his soul to the world. A shaky cell phone video of the incident that started it all had spread like wildfire. His voice had trembled through radio interviews, and he'd stood beside his father to rally this movement, but this moment felt heavier, more personal. Gripping the microphone, he stepped forward, and the room fell into a stillness so profound he could hear the faint creak of the floor beneath his boots. "My name is Caleb Wright," he began, his voice ringing out clear and unshaken, slicing through the tension like a blade. "I'm not just here as someone who's been wronged by injustice. I'm here as a son, as a citizen, as a man who still believes despite everything that real change is possible." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle, feeling the eyes of every soul in the room boring into him. Caleb's gaze swept over the crowd, lingering on faces he'd known his whole life: the grocer who'd slipped him candy as a boy, the librarian who'd helped him with school projects, the widow who'd lost her husband to a heart attack last spring. The changes were demanding. He continued, "They're not just about teaching officers new tricks or scribbling fresh rules on paper. They're about recognizing us people you're sworn to protect as human beings, with our pride, our worth still intact. It's about a kid not having to stammer out explanations for something he didn't do, his voice shaking while he's pinned against a wall. It's about making damn sure that respect isn't a privilege doled out based on the shade of someone's skin. And when that respect is trampled, there have to be consequential ones." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a swell of agreement that vibrated in the air, and Charles, watching from his seat, felt a surge of pride so fierce it nearly stole his breath. His son's words weren't just hard, they were felt, sinking deep into the marrow of everyone present. But the moment of unity shattered as abruptly as it had formed. From the back of the room, a man stood, his crisp suit and slick-back hair marking him as an outsider to the town's gritty heartbeat. Confidence oozed from him, the kind that came from years of unchallenged authority, and he raised a hand with the casual arrogance of someone used to being obeyed. The crowd turned, necks craning, as he introduced himself as David Walker, a mouthpiece from the mayor's office sent to keep an eye on the proceedings. "I'm sure we all admire the passion from the Wright family," he said, his tone smooth but edged with condescension. "But let's keep things in perspective. This doesn't reflect the day-to-day reality for most officers. We've got plenty of good folks out there doing a brutal job, and we don't need to overhaul everything because of one little hiccup." The officer in question was just following procedure. The room bristled, the air growing taut as a bowstring. Caleb's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing into slits of barely contained fury, while Charles felt the collective mood shift, anger simmering just beneath the surface, ready to boil over. This was it, the flashpoint they'd all been bracing for. The instant where those perched atop their ivory towers had to choose, cling to their crumbling excuses or face the truth clawing its way to the surface. Before anyone could respond, voices erupted from the crowd, raw and unscripted. Accountability, not excuses, a woman bellowed, her voice hoarse with years of unheard pleas. We need change, a young man roared, his fists clenched at his sides. The chorus swelled, chaotic but united, a wave crashing against the shore of power. Caleb stepped forward again, his voice slicing through the clamor like a lighthouse beam piercing fog. No more excuses, he declared, each word deliberate and unyielding. This isn't about one rogue cop, it's about a system that lets this happen. A culture that shrugs while people bleed. It's about every single person who's been crushed under that weight. We're done waiting. The crowd roared its approval, a thunderous echo that shook the walls. But all eyes soon swung back to David Walker. The mayor's man fidgeted, his polished veneer cracking under the scrutiny. He darted a glance at the officers on stage, then at the sea of faces staring him down. And something inside him seemed to buckle. His shoulders slumped, the bravado leaching from his frame like water from a broken dam. I didn't realize how deep this ran, Walker stammered, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Stripped of its earlier swagger, I see it. No, these aren't just complaints to brush off. We've got to tackle this, not with band-aids, but with something real. I'll take this to the mayor myself. We need a bigger conversation, a serious push for reform. The room stilled, the weight of his concession hanging like a held breath. It was a stunning reversal, a crack in the armor of authority no one had expected. For a heartbeat, disbelief reigned, then a quiet, hard-earned victory settled in its place. As the meeting drew to a close, the commissioner approached Charles and Caleb, his usual defensiveness replaced by a weary resolve. We've heard you, he said, meeting their eyes without flinching. This isn't just lip service anymore. We'll sit down with community leaders, build a real accountability system from the ground up. This is only the start. Charles nodded sharply, his mind already racing ahead to the battles still looming, the promises yet to be tested. Good, he replied, his voice low and firm. We'll make sure you keep your word. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of amber and violet, Charles and Caleb walked to their car in companionable silence. The day's weight clung to them, but there was a lightness to a fragile hope taking root. Caleb glanced at his father, a faint grin tugging at his lips. Dad, did you see that? Walker actually backed down. Charles chuckled, clapping a hand on his son's shoulder, his eyes crinkling with a rare warmth. Change can happen. Son, it's a hell of a fight, takes grit and stubbornness, but it's worth every second. Justice doesn't come cheap, but it's a price we can't stop paying. As they drove home through the quiet streets, the hum of the engine mingling with the distant chirp of crickets, they both felt it. This was no ending, but a beginning. The lesson was stark and unyielding. Power, when abused, bred consequences as inevitable as the dawn. They'd tipped the scales today, struck a blow against a system that thrived on silence, and proved that courage could bend even the most rigid wills. The world was finally starting to listen, and the echo of their stand would ripple far beyond the confines of their little town.